The desert sun blazed mercilessly as Eleanor Hayes pressed the cold steel of her father's pistol against Big Jim Callahan's temple, her trembling finger on the trigger. "You were my first act of courage," she whispered to the man who'd tried to own her. Behind her, Jake Morgan lay bleeding in the dust, the cowboy who'd sworn she'd be his last love. This is their story, a tale of freedom, survival, and love, forged in the unforgiving American frontier. Stay with me until the end and let me know in the comments which town you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The oil lamps flickered in the grimy windows of Carson Creek's saloons, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. It was past midnight on a humid August evening in 1882, and most decent folk had long since retreated behind locked doors. But Eleanor Hayes wasn't concerned with decency anymore. She was concerned with survival. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the general store, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might give away her position. The carpet bag in her left hand contained everything she owned in this world. 2 worn dresses, her mother's silver locket, a handful of coins she'd managed to squirrel away, and most importantly, her father's old Colt 45. The one thing he'd left behind when consumption took him 3 winters past. "Eleanor?" The voice boomed through the darkness, making her flinch. Big Jim Callahan's bellow carried the authority of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. "I know you're out there, girl. Your stepfather and I had a deal. You come on back now and we'll forget this foolishness." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the bile that rose in her throat. 3 hours ago, she'd overheard them in the parlor. Her stepfather, Marcus Hayes, and Big Jim negotiating her sale like she was livestock. $500 to clear Marcus's gambling debts, and she'd become another one of Big Jim's girls at the Desert Rose Saloon. "I ain't no man's property," she whispered to herself, repeating the words like a prayer. Her real father had taught her that back when she was just a slip of a girl helping him tend their small ranch outside of town, before the sickness took him, before her mother remarried in desperation, before everything went to hell. Eleanor heard boots on the boardwalk, multiple sets spreading out to search. Big Jim had brought his men. Of course he had. The man didn't become the most powerful figure in Carson Creek by leaving things to chance. He owned the Desert Rose, had his fingers in the silver mine operations, and kept the sheriff in his pocket like a lucky coin. She had to move. The old mare she'd saddled was tied behind the Methodist church 2 blocks away. If she could just reach it without being seen. "Check behind the buildings," Big Jim ordered. She couldn't have gotten far. Girl's never been beyond the town limits in her life. That was true, Eleanor thought bitterly. 19 years old, and she'd never seen anything but Carson Creek's dust and disappointment. Her mother had promised things would be different when she married Marcus, that they'd have security respectability. Instead, her mother had died of fever 2 years ago, leaving Eleanor trapped with a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to settle his debts. She crept along the wall, her boots barely making a sound on the hard-packed earth. The carpet bag bumped against her leg with each step, and she winced at every small noise it made. The church was just ahead now, its white steeple a ghostly finger pointing at the star-filled sky. "Boss, I found something." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. One of Big Jim's men had discovered the mare. She watched from the shadows as 3 figures converged on the church. "Well, well." Big Jim's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Looks like our little bird was planning to fly. Tommy, you stay here with the horse. She'll have to come for it eventually." But Eleanor was already backing away, her mind racing. Without the horse, she was trapped. The next town was 40 miles through desert terrain, impossible on foot, especially for someone who'd never traveled beyond Carson Creek's borders. She could hide, but for how long Big Jim owned this town? Eventually, someone would spot her and turn her in for the reward he'd surely offer. "Eleanor, sweetheart," Big Jim called out, his voice taking on a deceptively gentle tone. "I understand you're frightened. Change always is frightening. But think about this rationally. What's waiting for you out there? Desert bandits, Apache raids. You're a town girl, soft and pretty. The wilderness will eat you alive. With me, you'll have protection, comfort, a roof over your head. And a bed I'll have to share with any man who pays," Eleanor muttered under her breath. She thought of the girls at the Desert Rose, hollow-eyed women who moved through their days like ghosts smiling when required laughing at jokes that weren't funny, pretending not to feel the hands that grabbed at them. Mary Sullivan had been one of them before she'd tried to run last spring. They'd found her body 2 days later, officially declared a suicide. But Eleanor had seen the bruises on Mary's throat at the funeral, had noticed how quickly Big Jim had paid for a proper burial to keep people from asking questions. A door creaked open nearby, and Eleanor held her breath. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, stepped onto her back porch with a basin of water. The older woman's eyes swept the darkness, and for a moment Eleanor thought she'd been spotted. But Mrs. Patterson simply tossed the water into her garden and turned to go back inside. "Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor whispered urgently. The woman froze her hand on the door handle. "Who's there?" "It's Eleanor Hayes. Please, I need help." Mrs. Patterson's expression tightened. Even in the dim light, Eleanor could see the fear flash across her face. "Child, you need to go home. Your stepfather's looking for you." "He sold me to Big Jim Callahan. Please, I just need—" "I can't help you." The words came out sharp, final. "I'm sorry, but I have my own family to think about. Go home, Eleanor. Make your peace with your situation. We all have our crosses to bear." The door closed with a soft click, and Eleanor heard the sound of a bolt sliding into place. She wanted to scream, to pound on the door, to rage against the cowardice of good people who chose to look away. But she understood. Big Jim had tentacles wrapped around everyone in Carson Creek. Cross him, and you might find your husband out of work, your credit at the general store suddenly no good, your children harassed on their way to school. "Fan out!" Big Jim's voice boomed again. "Check every alley, every shed. $5 to the man who finds her." Eleanor ran, not toward any destination, but away from the voices, away from the boots thundering on boardwalks. She darted between buildings, her skirts catching on splinters and nails tearing the fabric. The carpet bag banged against her hip, slowing her down, but she couldn't abandon it. It held the gun, and the gun was her only chance if cornered. She found herself at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and cacti. The desert stretched out before her, vast and terrifying under the canopy of stars. She'd heard the stories, travelers dying of thirst just miles from water they couldn't find, bodies discovered months later picked clean by vultures and coyotes. But behind her lay a different kind of death, a slow suffocation of the soul, night after night of degradation, until she became like Mary Sullivan, desperate enough to take her own life rather than endure another day. "The desert, then," she whispered, and started walking. The first hour wasn't too bad. The night air was cool, and her initial burst of adrenaline carried her forward. She followed the stage road, figuring it had to lead somewhere eventually. Her boots, made for town streets, began to rub against her heels, but she ignored the growing discomfort. By the second hour, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She'd barely slept the night before, kept awake by her stepfather's drunken ranting about his debts. Now every step felt like lifting lead weights. The carpet bag seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. She stopped to rest on a large rock, pulling off her right boot to examine her heel. Even in the moonlight, she could see the blister that had formed, angry and red. She had no water to clean it, no bandages to protect it. She pulled the boot back on, wincing at the fresh spike of pain. That's when she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats behind her. Eleanor's heart sank. Of course, Big Jim would pursue her. The man's pride wouldn't allow a mere girl to defy him. She looked around desperately for cover, but the desert offered little, just low brush and the occasional boulder. She ran off the road, stumbling over rocks and roots in the darkness. A cluster of mesquite trees ahead offered the only real concealment. She dove behind them, pressing herself flat against the ground, trying to make herself invisible. The hoofbeats grew louder, and she could make out voices now. "She can't have gotten far on foot," one man said. "Probably collapsed somewhere nearby." "Big Jim wants her found before dawn," another replied. "Says it's bad for business if word gets out a girl slipped away from him." "What about the stepfather?" "Jim's keeping him locked in the Desert Rose's back room until we bring her back. Insurance, he calls it." Eleanor pressed her face into the dirt, hatred burning in her chest. Marcus might be a worthless drunk who'd sold her like chattel, but he was still the only family she had left. Big Jim was using him as leverage, knowing she might come back to prevent harm from coming to him. The riders passed within 20 feet of her hiding spot, their torches casting dancing shadows across the desert floor. Eleanor held her breath, certain they would hear her heart pounding, but they continued on, their voices fading into the distance. She waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place. Her dress was torn and dirty, her hands scraped from the rocky ground, but she was still free. She continued walking, staying off the road now, paralleling it from a distance. The night seemed endless, each step a monumental effort. Her throat grew parched, her lips cracking in the dry air. She'd been foolish not to bring water, but there hadn't been time to prepare properly. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Eleanor realized she was in serious trouble. The landscape around her was alien, hostile. She had no idea how far she'd walked or how much farther she had to go. Her feet were agony, her head spinning from dehydration. She stumbled, catching herself against a large saguaro cactus. The thorns pierced her palm, drawing blood. She cried out, then immediately clamped her other hand over her mouth. Sound carried in the desert. If Big Jim's men were still searching, that's when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Riders coming fast from the direction of Carson Creek. This time, there would be no hiding. The dawn light would expose her, and she could barely walk, let alone run. Eleanor reached into her carpet bag, her fingers closing around the cold metal of her father's Colt. She'd never fired it at a person, had only used it once to put down a rabid dog that had wandered onto their property. But she'd rather die fighting than be dragged back to Big Jim's establishment. She stood in the middle of the desert, legs spread for balance, the gun heavy in her two-handed grip. "Come on, then," she whispered through cracked lips. "Let's finish this." The riders grew closer, and she could make out 5 men. Big Jim rode in the center, his bulk unmistakable even at a distance. They spotted her and spurred their horses faster. Eleanor cocked the hammer, the click absurdly loud in the morning stillness. Her hands shook, but her resolve didn't waver. She had 6 bullets. She'd save the last one for herself if necessary. They pulled up about 30 feet away, horses snorting and pawing at the ground. Big Jim dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall, and broad as a barn door, with hands that could snap a neck as easily as a chicken bone. But his expression was almost paternal, disappointed rather than angry. "Eleanor," he said softly, "look at you. You're exhausted, dehydrated, probably haven't eaten since yesterday. This is no way for a young lady to behave." "I ain't going back with you," Eleanor said, proud that her voice didn't shake, even though everything else did. Now, no need for the gun. We're all civilized people here." Big Jim took a step forward. Eleanor fired. The bullet kicked up dust 2 feet to his left. Big Jim stopped, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "The next one won't miss," Eleanor lied. She could barely see straight, let alone aim properly. "You've got spirit," Big Jim said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "I like that. Shows you'll be an asset once you're properly trained. The customers pay extra for the ones with fire in them." "I'll die first." "No, you won't." His voice hardened. "You'll pull that trigger a few more times, maybe even hit one of us if you're lucky. But eventually you'll run out of bullets, and then my men will take you down. You'll wake up in a room at the Desert Rose, and you'll stay there until you learn to behave. The easy way or the hard way, Eleanor. Your choice." She saw the truth of it in his cold eyes. He'd broken stronger people than her. The Desert Rose was full of them women who'd fought at first, then gradually had their spirits crushed under the weight of Big Jim's relentless control. "My father would have killed you for this," she said. "Your father's dead girl, and your stepfather sold you fair and square, legal-like, even got it in writing. You're mine now, whether you accept it or not." One of the other men spoke up. "Boss, someone's coming." They all turned to look. A lone rider approached from the west, moving at an easy pace. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out details. A worn hat pulled low, a dusty coat, a rifle across his saddle. He rode like someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot, comfortable and relaxed, despite riding into a clearly tense situation. "Morning, gentlemen," the stranger said, pulling up about 20 feet away. His voice was gravelly, like he'd swallowed too much desert dust. "And lady, seems like an odd place for a gathering." "This ain't your concern, stranger," Big Jim said. "Ride on." The man pushed back his hat, revealing a weathered face, probably mid-30s, with eyes the color of sage honey and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Well, now that's where you might be wrong. See, when I spot a young woman holding a gun on 5 men in the middle of nowhere, I figure that makes it everybody's concern. This is a private matter, Big Jim insisted. The girl's a runaway. I'm taking her back to her family. The stranger's eyes flicked to Eleanor, taking in her torn dress, her bleeding hands, her obvious exhaustion. That true, miss? He's lying, Eleanor said quickly. My stepfather sold me to him. He runs a brothel in Carson Creek. The stranger nodded slowly as if this didn't surprise him. Big Jim Callahan, I'm guessing. Heard about you. Nothing good, I'm afraid. Big Jim's hand moved toward his gun. You'd best be moving along, friend. This doesn't concern you. See, that's the thing, the stranger said, shifting slightly in his saddle. The movement was casual, but Eleanor noticed how it positioned him better to draw his rifle. I've got a real problem with men who think they can buy and sell women like cattle. Call it a personal failing. You're 1 man against 5, one of Big Jim's men pointed out. True enough, the stranger agreed. But I'm willing to bet none of you are killers. Hired muscle, sure. Intimidators, absolutely. But killing a man in cold blood? That's different. That stays with you. He paused, his hand resting on his rifle. I, on the other hand, have killed men, more than I care to count. So the question you need to ask yourself is one runaway girl worth dying for? The tension stretched taut as a piano wire. Eleanor kept her gun trained on Big Jim, but her arms were getting tired, the weapon growing heavier by the second. What's your name, stranger? Big Jim asked. Jake Morgan. Eleanor saw Big Jim's eyes widen slightly in recognition. The Jake Morgan used to ride with the Baxter gang. Used to, Jake confirmed. Got tired of that life. Now I just drift, try to do right when I can. There's a lot of money in not doing right, Big Jim suggested. I could use a man with your reputation. Not interested. Big Jim's face darkened. Then you're a fool, and a dead one at that. Boys. Everything happened at once. Big Jim's men went for their guns. Jake's rifle was in his hands faster than Eleanor could follow. The morning air exploded with gunfire. When the dust settled, 2 of Big Jim's men were on the ground clutching wounds. The other 2 had their hands raised, their guns still in their holsters. Big Jim himself stood frozen, Jake's rifle pointed directly at his chest. Here's what's going to happen, Jake said calmly, as if he hadn't just shot 2 men in the span of 3 seconds. You're going to get on your horses and ride back to Carson Creek. You're going to forget about this girl. You're going to tear up whatever paper her stepfather signed. And if I hear you've come after her again, I'll come to Carson Creek myself and we'll settle this permanent-like. You can't protect her forever, Big Jim snarled. Don't need to, just long enough for her to get somewhere you can't reach. Jake's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. Now get, before I decide the world would be better off without Big Jim Callahan in it. Big Jim helped his wounded men onto their horses. As they prepared to leave, he turned back to Eleanor. This isn't over, girl. You can't run forever. Maybe not, Eleanor said, finding strength she didn't know she had. But I can run farther than you think. They watched the riders disappear into the distance. Only when they were completely out of sight did Eleanor lower her gun. Her arms felt like water and she sank to her knees in the dust. Jake dismounted and approached her slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. You hurt? Just tired, she managed. And thirsty. So thirsty. He retrieved a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. Small sips. Too much too fast will make you sick. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing Eleanor had ever experienced. She forced herself to drink slowly, even though every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. Thank you, she said when she could speak again. You saved my life. You were doing a pretty good job of that yourself, Jake observed. Not many would have the courage to face down Big Jim with nothing but an old colt and determination. I was terrified. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear. He studied her for a moment. Where were you planning to go? Eleanor laughed bitterly. I don't know. Anywhere. Just away. That's not much of a plan. It's all I had time for. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. Jake steadied her with a hand on her elbow. I suppose you'll be on your way now. And leave you out here alone, Big Jim might double back once I'm gone. He looked thoughtful. I'm heading to Fort Courage. It's about 3 days' ride from here. You could travel with me that far, figure out your next move from there. Eleanor studied him cautiously. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Maybe I don't like bullies. Maybe I think everyone deserves a chance at freedom. Or maybe, he gave a slight smile, I just don't have anything better to do. Take your pick. She wanted to trust him, but trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford. What do you want in return? Nothing, Jake said simply. Although if you can cook, I wouldn't say no to a decent meal. Been living on hardtack and jerky for 2 weeks. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself almost smiling. I can cook? Then we have a deal. You can ride with me. He looked at her feet, noting her limp. Can you ride? A little. My father taught me, but it's been years. Jake retrieved a spare horse from where he'd left it, tied to a scraggly bush. Apparently he traveled with a pack animal. It was a gentle-looking mare, brown with a white star on her forehead. This is Buttercup, he said. Don't let the name fool you. She's tough as nails and steady as a rock. She'll take care of you. Eleanor approached the horse carefully, letting Buttercup smell her hand before stroking her neck. The mare whickered softly, and Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her body. We should move, Jake said. Big Jim might send more men once he gets back to town. Best to put some distance between us and Carson Creek. He helped Eleanor mount his hands respectfully brief on her waist as he boosted her into the saddle. She arranged her torn skirts as best she could, grateful that she'd worn her sturdy boots despite the blisters they'd caused. They rode in silence for the first hour, Jake leading the way along paths Eleanor couldn't even see. He seemed to know the desert intimately, guiding them around obstacles and finding easier terrain when possible. You're not from around here? Eleanor observed, needing to break the silence. Texas originally, Jake replied. Been drifting for about 10 years now. Since you left the Baxter gang, his shoulders tensed slightly. You heard that part. Was it true? Does it matter? Eleanor considered this. I suppose not. You helped me when you didn't have to. That's what matters. The Baxter gang was a long time ago, Jake said after a pause. I was young, angry, thought the world owed me something. Took me a while to realize the only thing the world owes you is a chance to make something of yourself. What you do with that chance is up to you. What made you leave? Jake was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, We robbed a stagecoach. Thought it was carrying mine payroll. Turned out to be a family moving west. Parents, 3 kids. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5. He adjusted his hat, hiding his expression. Tom Baxter wanted to kill them all. No witnesses, he said. I disagreed. Things got heated. What happened? The family got away. Tom Baxter didn't. His voice was flat, emotionless. Been drifting ever since. Trying to balance the scales, I guess. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat. Jake shared his meager supplies, tough jerky and harder biscuits, but Eleanor ate gratefully. Her stomach had been empty since yesterday's noon meal. You mentioned your father taught you to shoot, Jake said, nodding at the Colt she'd tucked into her carpet bag. He must have been quite a man. He was, Eleanor said softly. Came out west after the war, said he'd seen enough death and wanted to build something instead of destroying it. We had a small ranch, nothing fancy, but it was ours. She smiled at the memory. He used to say that freedom wasn't free. You had to fight for it every day, even if that fight was just getting up and facing another day of hard work. Sounds like a wise man. He was. I wish. She trailed off, then shook her head. No use wishing for things that can't be. They remounted and continued on. The afternoon sun was brutal, and Eleanor was grateful for the hat Jake lent her, even though it was too big and kept sliding down over her eyes. As they rode, Jake began pointing out features of the landscape, which cacti held water in an emergency. How to spot snake holes, the signs that indicated water might be near. Eleanor absorbed it all, understanding that this knowledge might mean the difference between life and death if she found herself alone in the desert again. You're a quick study, Jake observed after she correctly identified tracks belonging to a kit fox. I had to be.
Eleanor replied. "After Father died, I tried to keep the ranch going, but a young woman alone,
The bank wouldn't extend credit. The other ranchers kept accidentally letting their cattle graze on our land, and then Marcus came along, promising Mother he'd take care of everything." Her voice turned bitter. "He took care of it all right. Sold the ranch within 6 months of the wedding, moved us to town so he could be closer to the saloons." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's not your fault." She straightened in her saddle. "Besides, I'm done being sorry for myself. From now on, I make my own way." That evening, they made camp in a small canyon that provided shelter from the wind and concealment from anyone who might be following. Jake showed Eleanor how to properly tend to the horses, checking their hooves for stones and brushing down their coats. "A man on foot in the desert is a dead man," he explained. "Take care of your horse, and it'll take care of you." Eleanor built the fire while Jake scouted the perimeter of their camp. She'd found a few wild onions during their ride and a handful of prickly pear fruits. Combined with Jake's remaining supplies and some quail eggs she'd spotted near a bush, she managed to create something resembling an actual meal. Jake's expression when he tasted her improvised stew was almost comical. "This is actually good." "Don't sound so surprised," Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile. "I told you I could cook." "You said you could cook. You didn't say you could perform miracles with trail rations and desert weeds." They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. The stars emerged one by one until the sky was a glittering tapestry. Eleanor had never seen so many stars in town where lamplight and smoke obscured the heavens. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "One of the few benefits of being in the middle of nowhere," Jake agreed. He pulled out a harmonica from his pocket. "Mind if I play?" Eleanor shook her head, and soon the melancholy notes of an old folk tune drifted through the night air. She recognized it, Shenandoah, and found herself humming along. "You have a nice voice," Jake said when the song ended. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "My mother sang in the church choir. She taught me." "Would you sing something?" She hesitated, then began singing Amazing Grace. Her voice was rough from thirst and exhaustion, but the melody was true. Jake accompanied her on the harmonica, and for a moment the harsh desert seemed softer, less threatening. When the song ended, Jake was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would be proud of you. For running away. For refusing to accept a fate you didn't choose. For being brave enough to face the unknown rather than submit to the unbearable." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Most people never find that kind of courage." "What about you?" Eleanor asked. "What are you running from?" Jake looked at her across the fire, his scarred face half in shadow. "Who says I'm running? This takes one to know one." He gave a short laugh. "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm running from the man I used to be. Problem is, no matter how far I go, he's always right there, looking back at me from every mirror, every water reflection." "Maybe you're not supposed to run from him," Eleanor suggested carefully. "Maybe you're supposed to make peace with him. Some things don't deserve peace. Some things don't deserve to have power over us forever either." Jake looked at her with something like surprise. "That's pretty wise for someone so young." "I'm 19, not 9, Eleanor said with a touch of indignation. "And I've seen enough to know that the past is like quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the deeper it pulls you down." They talked until the fire burned low, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. Eleanor learned that Jake had been educated back east before the war, that he could quote Shakespeare and calculate complex mathematics in his head. Jake learned that Eleanor had read every book in Carson Creek's small library, that she dreamed of seeing the ocean, that she'd once saved a wounded hawk and nursed it back to health. As Eleanor prepared her bedroll, Jake said, "I'll take first watch. You think Big Jim will follow us?" "Maybe, maybe not, but it's better to be cautious." He checked his rifle, ensuring it was within easy reach. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day." Eleanor lay down using her carpetbag as a pillow. Despite the hard ground and the danger that might be pursuing them, she felt safer than she had in months. There was something solid about Jake Morgan, something dependable despite his dark past. "Jake," she said softly. Yeah. Thank you for everything. Get some sleep, Eleanor. She closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the desert night. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the soft breathing of the horses. And underlying it all, the quiet presence of Jake keeping watch. She dozed fitfully, waking periodically to find Jake still alert, his silhouette, dark against the star-filled sky. Once she woke to see him standing at the edge of their camp rifle in hand, staring out into the darkness. She almost asked what he'd heard, but something in his posture told her to remain quiet. After what felt like an eternity, he returned to the fire, adding a few more sticks to keep it going. False alarm, she whispered. Maybe. Thought I heard horses, but it could have been wild mustangs. He glanced at her. You should be sleeping. So should you. I'll rest when we reach Fort Courage. Eleanor sat up, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. You can't go 3 days without sleep. I've done it before. That doesn't mean you should do it again. She moved to sit beside him. Teach me to keep watch properly. Then we can take turns. Jake looked skeptical. It's not just about staying awake. It's about knowing what to listen for, what's normal and what isn't. How to position yourself so you can see approaches but not be seen. Eleanor interrupted. I'm not completely ignorant. My father taught me some things. A small smile tugged at Jake's mouth. All right then. First rule of keeping watch. He taught her the basics, how to use peripheral vision in the darkness, the different sounds that signaled danger versus normal desert activity, how to stay alert without exhausting yourself through tension. Eleanor absorbed every word, understanding that these skills might one day save her life. When Jake finally agreed to rest, Eleanor took her position with serious determination. She kept the rifle across her lap, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. The desert seemed vast and full of threats, but also beautiful in its stark simplicity. A rustling in the brush made her tense, but then a small rabbit hopped into view, nose twitching as it investigated their camp. Eleanor remained still, and after a moment the rabbit continued on its way. Good, Jake said softly from his bedroll. You didn't overreact. I thought you were sleeping. I am. This is how I sleep when someone else is on watch. Eleanor shook her head but said nothing. She understood. Trust came hard to people who'd lived the kind of life Jake had. The rest of the night passed peacefully. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Eleanor woke Jake. All quiet, she reported. He sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. You did well. They broke camp quickly, Eleanor now knowing exactly how to help rather than standing aside awkwardly. As they prepared to mount, Jake paused. We need to talk about Fort Courage, he said. It's a rough place. Soldiers, miners, drifters, all kinds pass through there. You'll need to be careful. I understand. I'm not sure you do. He looked uncomfortable. A young woman alone, even in a place like Fort Courage, is going to attract attention. The kind of attention you just escaped from. Eleanor's jaw tightened. I'm not going back to Big Jim. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you need a plan. You can't just drift like I do. It's different for a woman. I know that, Eleanor said sharply. Then softer. I know, I've been thinking about it. Maybe I could find work as a seamstress or a cook. Respectable work. Maybe, Jake said, though his tone suggested doubt. Or maybe, he trailed off, looking thoughtful. What? There's a mission about 50 miles past Fort Courage, run by a couple named the Wheelers. They take in women who need shelter, help them get back on their feet, or move on to somewhere safe. I could take you there. Eleanor felt a mix of gratitude and something else, disappointment. She'd grown comfortable with Jake's company in just one day. The thought of parting ways made her feel unexpectedly vulnerable. That's 3 days past Fort Courage. About that. That's a lot to ask of you. You've already done so much. Jake shrugged. I've got nowhere pressing to be. They mounted and continued their journey. The landscape gradually changed, the harsh desert giving way to scrub plains with occasional clusters of cottonwoods indicating hidden water sources. Around midday, Jake suddenly held up his hand, signaling for quiet. He dismounted and crept forward to a small rise, peering over carefully. Eleanor watched him tense. He returned quickly, his face grim. Riders, about 8 of them moving fast from the direction of Carson Creek. Eleanor's heart sank. Big Jim? Can't tell from this distance, but probably. He looked around quickly, calculating. There's a box canyon about a mile east. We could hide there, but if they track us, we'd be trapped. What other choice do we have? We run. Push the horses hard, try to reach Fort Courage before they catch us. It's risky if one of the horses goes lame, we're done. Eleanor thought of the determined hatred she'd seen in Big Jim's eyes. He won't stop. Even if we escape now, he'll keep coming. Then we make sure he can't follow. Jake's expression was hard. You're not going to like what I'm about to suggest. Tell me. We ambush them. The land narrows about 2 miles ahead, forces travelers through a small pass. We could hold that pass, make them think twice about pursuing. 2 against 8. I faced worse odds, and we'd have the advantage of position. Eleanor reached into her carpet bag, pulling out her father's Colt. Then we fight. Jake looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Hayes. They rode hard for the pass, arriving just minutes ahead of the dust cloud that marked their pursuers' approach. Jake positioned Eleanor behind a large boulder with clear sightlines to the narrow trail below. Don't shoot unless you have to, he instructed. Let me do the talking first. Sometimes the threat of violence is more effective than violence itself. He took position on the opposite side of the pass, his rifle ready. They didn't have long to wait. The riders thundered into view, and Eleanor's heart sank. Big Jim led them, his face twisted with rage. But worse, she recognized the man riding beside him, Sheriff Watson from Carson Creek. Big Jim had brought the law with him. That's far enough, Jake called out. The riders pulled up sharply, horses dancing nervously as their riders looked for the source of the voice. Jake Morgan, Big Jim called back. You're interfering with a legal matter. The girl's stepfather has filed charges against her for theft. Sheriff Watson here has a warrant. That's a lie, Eleanor shouted before she could stop herself. That's you, Eleanor? Sheriff Watson called out. His voice held a note of genuine regret. Your stepfather says you stole money from him before you ran. Need you to come back and sort this out. How much did Big Jim pay you to say that? Eleanor demanded. The sheriff's silence was answer enough. Here's the problem, gentlemen, Jake said calmly. I don't believe you, and even if I did, I'm not inclined to hand over a young woman to a group of armed men in the middle of nowhere. Doesn't sit right with me. You're already wanted in 3 territories, Morgan, Big Jim said. You really want to add another charge to your record? I'm curious, Jake replied. How did you know who I was? Sheriff here recognized me, or did you do some checking after our last encounter? Does it matter? It might. See if you know who I am, then you know what I'm capable of. You know that pass you're sitting in is a killing field. I could drop half of you before you cleared leather. You're one man who survived 5 years with the Baxter gang. One man who's still breathing while Tom Baxter and his brothers are feeding worms. Jake's voice hardened. Ask yourself, Big Jim is one girl worth the lives of your men? Is she worth your life? Eleanor watched the men below shift nervously in their saddles. Big Jim's reputation was built on intimidation and political power, not gunfighting. His men were bully boys used to roughing up drunks and unarmed townspeople. She's mine, Big Jim said, but some of the conviction had left his voice. Bought and paid for. No human being is bought and paid for, Jake replied. This isn't the South before the war. There's no slavery here. It's a debt transfer. Legal contract. Then take it to a real court, not some bought sheriff in a town you own. See how it holds up before an actual judge. Sheriff Watson spoke up. Now see here, Morgan. Shut up, Watson. Jake cut him off. Everyone knows you're in Big Jim's pocket. Your badge means nothing out here. Eleanor saw one of the riders lean over to whisper to another. She caught the words, not worth it, on the wind. Big Jim must have sensed his men's weakening resolve. There'll be a bounty on you, Morgan, both of you. You'll be hunted wherever you go. I've been hunted before, still here. The girl won't last. She's soft city bred. First hard winter. First real challenge. She'll come crawling back. Maybe, Jake said. But that'll be her choice, not yours. The standoff stretched taut. Eleanor's finger rested on the trigger of her Colt, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it in the pass below. Finally, Big Jim yanked his horse's head around. "This isn't over, Morgan. You've made an enemy today. I've got plenty of those. One more won't keep me up at night." The riders wheeled and galloped back the way they'd come, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Eleanor didn't move until Jake appeared at her side. "They're gone," he said. "For now." Eleanor's hands were shaking as she holstered the Colt. "Would you really have shot them? If they'd tried to take you?" "Yes." He said it simply without bravado or hesitation. "Why, you barely know me." Jake was quiet for a moment, watching the dust cloud disappear into the distance. "Maybe because I recognize something in you. That desperation for freedom, for a second chance. Or maybe because I'm tired of seeing men like Big Jim always win." He looked at her. "Does it matter? I suppose not." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back angrily. She'd cried enough. "What now?" "Now we ride hard for Fort Courage. Big Jim might come back with more men, or he might try to get ahead of us. Either way, we need to move." They pushed the horses as hard as they dared, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The sun traced its arc across the sky, and Eleanor lost herself in the rhythm of riding the steady beat of hooves on earth. As the sun began to set, painting the landscape in shades of orange and red, Jake pointed ahead. "There, Fort Courage." Eleanor saw it a collection of buildings clustered around what must have been an old military fort. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could make out people moving along the streets. "We made it," she breathed. "This far," Jake corrected. "But Big Jim won't give up easily. We'll need to be careful." They rode into town as darkness fell, drawing curious looks from the people they passed. Fort Courage was exactly as rough as Jake had warned. Saloons outnumbered other businesses 3-1, and hard-eyed men lounged in doorways, evaluating newcomers like wolves studying sheep. Jake led them to a boarding house that looked marginally more respectable than its neighbors. The proprietress, a stern woman named Mrs. Garrett, looked Eleanor up and down with sharp eyes. "She running from something?" she asked Jake bluntly. "Someone," Jake corrected. "Someone who doesn't have any claim on her except what he tried to take by force." Mrs. Garrett's expression softened slightly. "I've got a room. $2 a night paid in advance. No men above the ground floor, no exceptions." Jake paid for 3 nights before Eleanor could protest. "Consider it an investment in not having to watch my back," he said when she tried to object. Mrs. Garrett showed Eleanor to a small but clean room. "Lock your door at night," she advised. "And if anyone gives you trouble, you scream loud enough to wake the dead. I've got a shotgun, and I'm not afraid to use it." Eleanor thanked her and collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to remove her boots. She was asleep within minutes, her exhausted body finally able to rest, knowing she was for the moment safe. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and someone knocking on her door. "Eleanor, it's Jake." She opened the door to find him holding a tray with breakfast and a package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Garrett's cooking," he explained, setting the tray on the small table. "And I thought you might need these." He indicated the package. Eleanor opened it to find a simple but sturdy traveling dress undergarments and a pair of proper boots. "How did you—" "Mrs. Garrett helped. Said you couldn't go around in a torn dress if you wanted to be taken seriously." Eleanor felt tears threaten again. Kindness after so much cruelty was almost harder to bear. "I'll pay you back." "No need. Consider it a gift." He moved to the window, looking out at the street below. "I've been asking around. Big Jim hasn't shown up yet, but that doesn't mean he won't." "What about the mission you mentioned, the Wheelers?" "I sent them a message with a freight driver heading that way. If they have room, we can leave tomorrow." Eleanor studied his profile, noting the tension in his shoulders. "You're worried about something else." Jake turned from the window. "You're perceptive." He hesitated, then said, "There's a marshal in town, Sam Cray. We've crossed paths before." "Is he looking for you?" "Not actively, but if he recognizes me, he might decide to do his duty." Eleanor felt a chill. "What would that mean?" "Best case, he tells me to move on. Worst case," Jake shrugged. Let's just say I'd rather avoid him. Then we leave. Now. We don't have to wait. Yes, we do. You need rest, proper food, a chance to recover. And traveling without a destination is how people end up dead in the desert. His expression softened. Don't worry about me. I've been dodging the law for years. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she saw the wisdom in his words. She was exhausted and her body ached from the hard riding. All right, she conceded. But if there's trouble because of me, there won't be. Eat your breakfast. I'll be back this afternoon. After he left, Eleanor changed into the new dress, marveling at how much better she felt in clean, intact clothing. She ate the breakfast eggs biscuit and even some preserved peaches, slowly savoring each bite. Later, she ventured downstairs where Mrs. Garrett was manning the front desk. Feeling better? The older woman asked. Much. Thank you for your help with the clothes. That man of yours seemed mighty concerned about you. He's not my... We're just traveling together. Mrs. Garrett gave her a knowing look. If you say so. But I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching, and the way you look at him. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. It's not like that. Maybe not yet. Mrs. Garrett leaned forward conspiratorially. But that Jake Morgan is a good man despite what others might say about his past. I've seen him here before. Always polite, always pays his debts, never causes trouble unless trouble finds him first. You know who he is? Honey, everyone knows who Jake Morgan is, or was, the man who brought down the Baxter gang from the inside that takes a special kind of courage, or maybe a special kind of crazy. She studied Eleanor. Either way, you could do worse for a protector. Eleanor spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Garrett with chores needing something to occupy her hands and mind. She learned that Fort Courage had started as an actual military fort, but had been abandoned after the Indian Wars ended. Now it served as a waypoint for travelers, a place where law was more suggestion than rule. But we manage, Mrs. Garrett said. Most folks just want to live their lives in peace. It's only a few who cause problems. As the sun began to set, Jake returned, but his expression was grim. What's wrong? Eleanor asked immediately. Big Jim's in town. Arrived an hour ago with a dozen men. Eleanor's blood turned cold. He found us. Was only a matter of time. But there's more. Jake glanced at Mrs. Garrett, who was pretending not to listen, while obviously hanging on every word. He's spreading money around trying to buy information, and he's got Sheriff Watson making noise about that warrant. But Watson has no authority here, Mrs. Garrett interjected, abandoning her pretense. No, but Marshal Cray might honor it as a professional courtesy, Jake explained, especially if Big Jim makes it worth his while. Eleanor sank into a chair. I should leave. Now. Before what, you run off half-cocked and get yourself killed? Jake shook his head. We stick to the plan. The Wheelers sent word back. They'll take you in. We leave at first light. What about the marshal? Let me worry about him. That evening, Eleanor helped Mrs. Garrett prepare dinner for the boarding house guests. It was a simple meal, but Eleanor took comfort in the familiar routine of cooking. She was setting the table when she heard raised voices from outside. Through the window, she saw Big Jim in the street flanked by his men. He was talking to a tall man with a marshal's badge, Sam Cray, she assumed. No, she's here, Big Jim was saying. The Morgan fellow, too. They're both wanted. Morgan's not wanted in this territory, the marshal replied. His voice was deep measured. And I haven't seen any warrant that would hold up in a real court. I've got the sheriff right here. Watson's authority ends at Carson Creek's town limits. You know that as well as I do. Big Jim's face reddened. I'm offering a substantial reward for information, and I'm telling you to keep your money. This isn't Carson Creek Callahan. You can't buy the law here. Eleanor felt a spark of hope, but then Big Jim smiled a cold, calculating expression. Maybe not, but I can make things difficult for anyone harboring fugitives. Bad for business, you might say. The threat was clear. Eleanor turned from the window to find Jake standing behind her, his expression dark. Pack your things, he said quietly. We leave tonight. Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She hurried to her room, stuffing her few belongings back into the carpet bag with trembling hands. The new dress Mrs. Garrett had helped procure her father's colt. the remains of her old life. Everything went in haphazardly. Through the thin walls, she could hear Big Jim's voice growing louder in the street, working the gathering crowd like a carnival barker. $500 to anyone who brings me information about the girl. She's a thief and a runaway, and justice demands she be returned. Jake appeared in her doorway, his own gear packed and ready. Backstairs, Mrs. Garrett's holding them there with the horses. They crept down the narrow service stairway, the old wood creaking under their weight, despite their attempts at stealth. Mrs. Garrett stood at the bottom, shotgun in hand, her face set in determined lines. "They're saddled and ready," she said quietly. "Food and water in the saddlebags. There's a hunter's trail that starts behind the old mission ruins, leads north around the town. Most folks don't know about it." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, grasping the older woman's hand. "For everything." "You remind me of myself when I was young," Mrs. Garrett said. "Running from a man who thought he owned me. Difference is, you've got someone decent to help you." She looked at Jake meaningfully. "You take care of her, Morgan, or I'll hunt you down myself." "Yes, ma'am," Jake said with genuine respect. They led the horses quietly through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows. The moon was just a sliver, providing barely enough light to navigate, but not enough to make them easily visible. Eleanor's heart pounded with each step, certain that at any moment someone would shout an alarm. They had almost reached the mission ruins when a figure stepped out of the darkness ahead of them. Eleanor's hand went to her gun, but Jake caught her wrist, shaking his head slightly. "Evening, Morgan." Marshal Sam Cray said, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "Miss Hayes?" "Marshal," Jake replied evenly. "Nice night for a ride." "So it seems." Cray studied them for a long moment. "Interesting thing, Big Jim Callahan showing up here with all that money and bluster. Makes a man wonder what's really going on." "Nothing that concerns the law," Jake said carefully. "Maybe. Maybe not." The marshal shifted his weight. "I did some checking after Callahan started making noise. Funny thing, there's no record of any theft report filed in Carson Creek before yesterday. Seems like Sheriff Watson only remembered to file it after the girl had already run." Eleanor held her breath, not daring to speak. "Moreover," Cray continued, "I had a talk with a traveling preacher who passed through Carson Creek last week. He mentioned hearing about some unsavory business regarding a young woman being sold to settle gambling debts. Terrible thing if true." "Terrible," Jake agreed, his voice neutral. Marshal Cray stepped aside, clearing their path. "You know my jurisdiction ends at the town limits. What happens beyond that, well, it's out of my hands. Though I'd suggest avoiding the main road for a while. Lots of unsavory types out there at night." "We'll keep that in mind," Jake said. As they passed, Cray added quietly, "The Wheelers are good people. They'll take care of her. And Morgan. That thing with the Baxters, most folks think you did the right thing, even if the law can't say so officially." Jake nodded once, and they moved past into the darkness. Eleanor didn't speak until they were well clear of the town, following the narrow trail Mrs. Garrett had described. "He let us go," she said, still hardly believing it. "Sam Cray's a complicated man," Jake replied. "He believes in the law, but he also believes in justice. Sometimes those aren't the same thing." They rode through the night, the trail winding through rough country that would be difficult for pursuers to navigate quickly. Jake seemed to know exactly where he was going, even in the darkness, guiding them around obstacles Eleanor could barely see. As dawn broke, they stopped to rest the horses near a small spring. Eleanor splashed water on her face, trying to wash away the exhaustion that clung to her like dust. "How much farther to the mission?" she asked. 2 days, maybe less if we push hard." Jake was scanning their back trail, looking for signs of pursuit. "But Big Jim won't give up easily. He's invested too much in this now money reputation. Men like him can't stand being defied, especially by a woman." "I know." Eleanor sat on a flat rock, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd done. "Maybe I should have just—" "Don't." Jake's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare second-guess yourself now. You did the only thing you could do. The brave thing." "Brave?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "I'm terrified. I've been terrified since the moment I ran." Jake moved to sit beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel his solid presence. I told you before, courage isn't about not being afraid. Every brave thing I've ever seen done was done by someone who was scared out of their mind, but did it anyway. Is that how you felt when you stood up to Tom Baxter? Jake was quiet for a moment. I was terrified. Tom was faster than me, meaner than me, and had his brothers backing him. But there was a little girl in that stagecoach, couldn't have been more than 5, had these big brown eyes just like… He stopped abruptly. Like what? Like my sister's, before the fever took her. He picked up a small stone, turning it over in his hands. I couldn't let Tom kill that little girl, even if it meant my own death. Eleanor wanted to reach out to offer comfort for the old pain she heard in his voice, but she didn't know if it would be welcome. Instead, she said, "You saved them." That time. But how many times before that did I stand by while Tom did terrible things? How many innocents suffered because I was too much of a coward to act sooner? You can't change the past. No, but I can try to balance the scales going forward. He looked at her. That's why I helped you. Not just because it was right, but because every person I help is a small weight on the other side of that scale. They remounted and continued on, the sun climbing higher and hotter. The landscape changed again, becoming more mountainous, with pine trees appearing among the desert scrub. It should have been beautiful, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. Her instincts proved correct when Jake suddenly held up his hand, pulling his horse to a stop. He dismounted quickly, moving to examine the ground. Tracks, he said grimly. Fresh. Maybe 6 riders moving fast. Big Jim. Probably. Or bounty hunters he's hired. Jake straightened his hand, moving to his rifle. They're maybe an hour behind us. We should run. No, running in daylight, they'll spot our dust trail. Better to find defensive ground and let them pass. He looked around quickly, then pointed to a cluster of rocks above them. There. We can hide the horses behind those boulders and watch the trail. They climbed the steep slope, leading the horses carefully over the loose rocks. Behind the boulder formation was a small, sheltered area, invisible from below. Jake positioned himself where he could watch the trail while Eleanor held the horses, keeping them quiet. Time crawled by. Eleanor found herself studying Jake as he kept watch, noting the way he held himself relaxed but ready like a coiled spring. There was something both dangerous and protective about him, a contradiction that should have frightened her but instead made her feel safe. "Riders," he whispered. Eleanor peered through a gap in the rocks. 6 men were approaching along the trail, and her heart sank when she recognized the lead rider, not Big Jim, but his foreman, a brutal man named Cole Jessup. She'd seen him break a man's arm once for spilling a drink. "That's Cole Jessup," she breathed. "Big Jim's right hand. Know him, so… He's cruel, enjoys hurting people." She shuddered. The girls at the Desert Rose were terrified of him. The riders passed below them so close Eleanor could hear their conversation. "Tracks lead this way, but they're getting harder to follow," one man was saying. "They're heading for that mission," Cole replied. Big Jim figured as much. He's taking the main road with the others' plans to get there first. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Big Jim was ahead of them, not behind. "What if they don't show…" "Then we burn the mission down," Cole said casually. "Those holy rollers will give her up quick enough when their life's work is in flames." The riders continued on, their voices fading. Jake and Eleanor remained frozen for several more minutes, ensuring they were truly gone. "We can't go to the mission," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "I won't bring destruction to innocent people." "No," Jake agreed. "We can't." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's another option. It's dangerous, but it might be our only chance." "What?" "We go over the mountains. There's a pass I know too rough for most riders. It'll take us to the other side, to New Mexico territory. Big Jim won't have any influence there." "How rough?" "Very, and it'll add days to our journey. We'll need supplies." Eleanor thought of the Wheelers probably preparing for her arrival, unaware of the danger heading their way. "We should warn them. I'll send word when we reach the next settlement." Jake studied her face. "Are you sure about this? The mountain route? It's not easy. And once we cross into New Mexico, you'll be truly on your own." "I've been on my own since my mother died," Eleanor said firmly.
At least now I'm choosing my own path. They backtracked carefully, taking a different trail that led higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The horses struggled with the steep grade and loose footing, and several times they had to dismount and lead them by hand. As afternoon gave way to evening, they reached a small plateau with a view of the valley below. In the distance, Eleanor could see smoke rising, too much smoke for campfires. "The mission?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jake's jaw tightened. "Looks like it." Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes. "Those poor people."
Because of me. Because of Big Jim, Jake corrected firmly. "You didn't choose this. He did. The blood is on his hands, not yours. But if I hadn't run, then you'd be in a cage at the Desert Rose, dying a little more each day until there was nothing left of Eleanor Hayes but a hollow shell." He turned to face her fully. Evil men count on good people blaming themselves for the evil men's actions. Don't give him that power. They made camp in a cave Jake knew about, sheltered from the wind and hidden from view. As Eleanor tended to the horses, she noticed Jake favoring his left side. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing. Old wound acting up from all the riding." "Let me see." "Eleanor." "Let me see," she insisted. Reluctantly, Jake removed his coat and shirt, revealing a mass of scar tissue along his ribs. But there was fresh blood, too, seeping through a bandage Eleanor hadn't noticed before. "When did this happen?" "Caught a ricochet when we held the pass against Big Jim the first time." "It's not serious." "It's bleeding. That makes it serious." Eleanor retrieved the medical supplies from her carpet bag, another thing her father had insisted she always carry. "Sit down." Jake complied, and Eleanor carefully cleaned and rebandaged the wound. She tried not to notice the other scars covering his torso, each one telling a story of violence survived. "You've lived a hard life," she said softly. "I've lived the life I chose, for better or worse. Do you regret it?" Jake considered the question. "I regret the harm I caused. I regret not seeing Tom Baxter for what he was sooner, but the path that led me here to this moment." He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "No, I don't regret that." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks and focused on securing the bandage. "There. That should hold." "Thank you." Jake pulled his shirt back on. "You'd make a good nurse. My mother taught me. She said a woman should know how to heal as well as she knows how to do anything else." They shared a meal of dried meat and biscuits, sitting at the cave mouth and watching the stars emerge. Despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the tragedy unfolding in the valley below, Eleanor felt a strange peace. "Tell me about New Mexico," she said. "It's different from here. Older in some ways. The Spanish were there long before Americans arrived. There are ancient ruins older than anything you can imagine. The people are a mixed Spanish-Indian-Anglo, all trying to make their way. Have you spent much time there?" "Some. Worked cattle near Santa Fe for a while. It's beautiful country, but harsh. The mountains are higher, the desert's drier. But there's freedom there if you're strong enough to claim it." "And if I'm not strong enough?" Jake looked at her, his expression serious. "Eleanor, you faced down Big Jim Callahan with nothing but an old Colt and determination. You left everything you knew rather than accept a fate you didn't choose. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." "I don't feel strong. I feel scared and lost and—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the mix of emotions churning inside her. "That's because you're human. Strength isn't about not feeling those things. It's about feeling them and continuing anyway." That night, Eleanor took the first watch while Jake rested. She sat with her back against the cave wall, her father's gun in her lap, and thought about how much had changed in just a few days. This time last week, she'd been serving her stepfather his supper, trying to avoid his drunken temper. Now she was in a cave on a mountainside, fleeing toward an uncertain future with a man she barely knew but trusted more than anyone she'd met since her father died. A sound made her tense rocks shifting below them. She moved carefully to the cave mouth, peering into the darkness. A figure was climbing toward them, trying to be stealthy, but not quite succeeding. Eleanor cocked her pistol, the sound carrying in the still night air. The figure froze. "That's far enough?" She called out, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Don't shoot!" The voice was young, frightened. "Please,
I'm looking for Jake Morgan. Mrs. Garrett said he might be this way. Jake was beside her, instantly, rifle ready. Who are you? Tommy Brennan, sir, from Fort Courage. Mrs. Garrett sent me with a message. Jake considered, then said, Come up slowly. Hands where we can see them. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 16, climbed into view. He was trembling, whether from cold or fear, Eleanor couldn't tell. What's the message? Jake asked. Big Jim's put a $1,000 bounty on Miss Hayes, dead or alive. The boy swallowed hard. Every bounty hunter and desperado in 3 territories is going to be looking for you. Mrs. Garrett said to tell you to avoid the settlements, trust no one. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. $1,000 was more money than most people saw in 5 years. There's more, Tommy continued. Marshal Cray arrested Big Jim. What? Jake's surprise was evident. For burning the mission. The Wheelers escaped, but 2 of their hired hands died in the fire. That makes it murder, but Big Jim's got expensive lawyers coming from San Francisco. Marshall says he probably won't hold him long. Jake pulled out a few coins, pressing them into Tommy's hand. Thank you for the risk you took bringing this message. Now get back before you're missed. Yes, sir. And sir, good luck. After the boy left, Eleanor sank onto a rock, overwhelmed. $1,000. Dead or alive. We knew he wouldn't give up easily. But this changes everything. Every person we meet, every town we pass through, anyone could be hunting me. Jake knelt in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. Look at me. When she did, he continued, We're going to get through this. We'll cross the mountains, get to New Mexico. Once we're there, we'll find a place where Big Jim's money doesn't reach. How can you be sure? Because I won't let anything happen to you. The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. I swear it, Eleanor. I'll see you safe. Why? She whispered. Why do you care so much? For a moment she thought he might answer, might voice whatever it was she saw burning in his eyes. But then he stood, stepping back. We should rest. Tomorrow's going to be a hard climb. Eleanor wanted to press to demand an answer, but she recognized the wall he'd put up. Instead, she returned to the cave, wrapping herself in her blanket and trying not to think about how empty she'd felt when he'd stepped away. The next morning brought new challenges. The trail Jake had mentioned was barely visible, more goat path than proper route. They had to dismount frequently, leading the horses over treacherous sections where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. By midday, they were above the tree line, the air thin and cold. Eleanor's lungs burned with each breath, and she could see the horses struggling too. How much further? She gasped during a rest break. To the top, another hour, maybe 2, then it's downhill to the other side. And then we're in New Mexico. Jake was studying their back trail through a small telescope. No sign of pursuit, the climb's too hard for most. Including us, nearly. Jake smiled slightly. But we're not most people, are we? They continued climbing, and Eleanor found herself thinking about her father. He'd always said the Hayes family was made of stern stuff, that they could endure anything if they had to. She hoped he was right. The summit. When they finally reached it, took Eleanor's breath away, and not just from the altitude. The view stretched for miles in every direction, mountains and valleys painted in shades of blue and purple clouds casting moving shadows across the landscape. It's beautiful, she breathed. Worth the climb. Worth everything. They began the descent, which proved just as treacherous as the ascent. Jake went first, testing each section before allowing Eleanor to follow. It was slow, careful work, and the sun was setting by the time they reached the tree line on the far side. We'll camp here tonight, Jake decided. The horses need rest, and so do we. They found a sheltered spot among the pines, and Eleanor gathered wood while Jake tended to the horses. The simple domesticity of it made her heart ache for something she couldn't quite name. As they sat by the fire, Jake pulled out his harmonica. Any requests? Something hopeful, Eleanor said. Something about new beginnings. Jake played O Susanna, and Eleanor found herself singing along, changing the words to fit their situation. Oh, New Mexico, don't you cry for me? I've come from Arizona with my pistol on my knee. Jake laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. You have a nice laugh, she said without thinking, then immediately blushed. Haven't had much cause for it lately.
Jake replied, his expression softening. You bring it out of me. They looked at each other across the fire, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, some invisible barrier beginning to crumble. Jake, she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but needing to say something. We should reach the first New Mexico settlement tomorrow, he said quickly, looking away. You'll need to decide what you want to do from there. Eleanor felt the moment slip away, replaced by cold reality. You're leaving. That was always the plan. Get you somewhere safe, then move on. And if nowhere is safe, if Big Jim's bounty follows me everywhere. It won't. Bounties fade when the money dries up or the man offering it is in prison. Or when the target is dead, Eleanor added quietly. Jake's expression hardened. That's not going to happen. You can't protect me forever. Watch me. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Eleanor's heart race. What if I don't want you to leave? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, I'm not the kind of man you build a life with. I'm a wanderer, a man with blood on his hands and prices on his head. You deserve better. Shouldn't I get to decide what I deserve? Not when you're vulnerable, scared, and I'm the only friendly face you've seen in days. That's not choosing, that's clinging to the nearest safe harbor. His words stung, but Eleanor heard the pain beneath them, the self-loathing that made him push her away. You're right, she said quietly. I am scared, I am vulnerable, but I'm not confused about how I feel. Are you? Jake stood abruptly. I'll take first watch. Eleanor watched him walk to the edge of their camp, his shoulders rigid with tension. She wanted to go to him to demand he stop running from whatever was growing between them, but she recognized the fear in his posture, not of Big Jim or bounty hunters, but of hope of allowing himself to want something good. She lay down, pulling her blanket tight against the mountain cold. Tomorrow they would reach New Mexico. Tomorrow Jake would probably disappear from her life. And tomorrow she would have to figure out how to build a new life from nothing but determination and a $1,000 death sentence hanging over her head. As sleep finally took her, she thought she heard Jake whisper something to the night wind, but the words were lost in the sighing of the pines. She woke to Jake shaking her shoulder urgently. Rider's coming. We need to move. Eleanor was instantly alert, grabbing her belongings as Jake saddled the horses with practiced efficiency. They could hear voices now echoing up from below. The tracks lead this way. They can't be far. Remember, Big Jim wants the girl alive if possible. Morgan's fair game. Eleanor's blood ran cold. They'd been found. Jake lifted her onto Buttercup, then mounted his own horse. There's a river gorge about a mile from here. If we can reach it, we might lose them. They rode hard through the pre-dawn darkness, branches whipping at their faces, the sound of pursuit growing closer. Eleanor could hear her heart pounding in her ears, matching the thunder of hooves. The gorge appeared suddenly, a dark slash across the landscape. Jake didn't hesitate, plunging down the steep bank into the water. Eleanor followed, gasping as the icy current hit her legs. Stay close, Jake called over the rush of water. The current's strong. They rode downstream, the water rising to the horses' bellies. Behind them, shouts indicated their pursuers had reached the gorge. There, in the water, gunfire erupted, bullets splashing into the water around them. Jake pulled his rifle, returning fire one-handed while maintaining control of his horse. Keep going, he shouted to Eleanor. She bent low over Buttercup's neck, urging the mare forward. The gorge narrowed ahead, the walls rising sheer on either side. They were trapped between the river and their pursuers. Then she saw it, a narrow cleft in the rock wall, barely visible in the dim light. Jake. There. He saw it too, guiding his horse toward the opening. They squeezed through, finding themselves in a hidden canyon beyond. The sounds of pursuit faded as their hunters continued downstream, missing the concealed entrance. They climbed out of the water onto a sandy bank, both horses trembling from exhaustion and cold. Eleanor was soaked through, shivering uncontrollably. We need to get you warm, Jake said, noticing her condition. They found an overhang that provided shelter and concealment. Jake built a small fire, risky but necessary. Eleanor huddled close to it, her teeth chattering. You need to get out of those wet clothes, Jake said, then immediately looked away. I'll turn my back. Eleanor wanted to argue, but hypothermia was a real danger.
She quickly changed into the spare dress from her bag, grateful she'd wrapped it in oilcloth. When she was decent, she said, "All right." Jake turned back, his expression carefully neutral. He'd changed his own shirt. She noticed the wet one hanging from a rock to dry. "Thank you," she said, "for the river. I would never have thought of that." "Old outlaw trick. Water doesn't leave tracks." They sat in silence, listening for any sound of their pursuers. The sun rose higher, painting the hidden canyon in shades of gold and red. "It's almost over," Eleanor said suddenly. "What do you mean? This? Us running together? We're nearly to New Mexico, and then—" She trailed off, unable to voice the ending she didn't want. Jake was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, there's something I need to tell you." Her heart leaped. "Yes." "The real reason I can't stay with you, it's not just my past or the danger I bring." He took a breath. "I'm dying." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "What? Consumption. Same thing that took your father. I've had it for about a year. Most days are good, but it's getting worse." Eleanor stared at him. Everything suddenly making terrible sense, the occasional coughs he'd tried to hide, the way he sometimes struggled for breath during hard riding, the fatalistic way he faced danger. "How long?" she whispered. "Doc and Amarillo gave me maybe another year, possibly 2 if I'm lucky." "And you didn't think to tell me this before I—" She stopped, unable to admit what she'd been about to say. "Before you what?" Jake's voice was gentle. "Before I fell in love with you." She said the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and pain. Jake closed his eyes as if the words hurt him. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you. You've lost enough, Eleanor. You don't need to watch another person you care about waste away. That wasn't your choice to make. Wasn't it? Would you have let me help you if you'd known, or would you have tried to protect me, coddle me, probably getting yourself killed in the process?" Eleanor wanted to deny it, but she knew he was right. She would have tried to shield him, and it might have cost them both. "So your plan is to deliver me to safety, and then go off to die alone?" "That's been my plan for a year. Die somewhere peaceful, where I'm not a burden to anyone." "You're not a burden?" Eleanor said fiercely. "You're—" She stopped, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't sort through. "I'm a dead man walking," Jake finished, "and you're a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Once Big Jim is dealt with, you'll find somewhere to settle, maybe meet someone who can give you the life you deserve." "What if I don't want that life? What if I want—" Shouts echoed through the canyon, cutting her off. Their pursuers had discovered the hidden entrance. Jake was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Mount up. There's another way out, but it's narrow." They rode deeper into the canyon, the walls closing in until they were riding single file. Behind them, the shouts grew closer. The passage ended in a steep climb up loose shale. The horses struggled, hooves slipping on the unstable surface. Eleanor heard Jake suppress a coughing fit, saw him grip his saddle horn to stay upright. They crested the rise to find themselves on a mesa overlooking the desert. In the distance, Eleanor could see buildings, a settlement. "That's Las Cruces," Jake said, his voice rough. "New Mexico territory." "We made it." "Almost. We still have to—" His words were cut off by gunfire. Riders emerged from behind a rock formation, not the ones who'd been following them, but new threats. Bounty hunters who'd been waiting. "The girl," one shouted. "Take her alive!" Jake wheeled his horse, putting himself between Eleanor and the attackers. "Ride!" he shouted. "Get to the town. Not without you. Eleanor, go!" But she couldn't leave him. Instead, she pulled her father's Colt, firing at their attackers. Her first shot went wide, but the second found its mark, sending one man tumbling from his saddle. Jake fought like a man possessed, his rifle cracking again and again. But there were too many, and Eleanor saw him sway in his saddle, his illness and exhaustion taking their toll. A rider got past Jake, bearing down on Eleanor. She fired, but the gun clicked empty. The man reached for her, and she struck him with the pistol butt, but his grip was strong, dragging her from her saddle. "Got her!" he shouted triumphantly. The world exploded. Jake had arrived, launching himself from his horse to tackle Eleanor's attacker. They went down in a tangle of limbs rolling in the dust. Jake was stronger, but his illness made him slower, and the other man got on top, hands around Jake's throat. Eleanor grabbed a rock, bringing it down hard on the attacker's head.
He collapsed and Jake gasped for air, coughing violently. The remaining bounty hunters circled them, guns drawn. Eleanor helped Jake to his feet, supporting him as he struggled to breathe. "It's over," one of them said. "Come quietly, girl, and we might let Morgan live." Eleanor looked at Jake, saw the resignation in his eyes. He was preparing to make a last stand to buy her time to escape, even if it cost him his life. "No," she said firmly. Then louder, "No, I'm Eleanor Hayes, and I'm worth $1,000 to you, but only if I'm delivered alive and unharmed. You kill him, and I'll make sure Big Jim never pays you a cent." The bounty hunters exchanged glances. "You're hardly in a position to make demands." "I'm in the perfect position. I know Big Jim Callahan. He wants me broken submissive. You deliver me fighting and screaming about how you killed the man I love, and he'll see damaged goods. He might even refuse to pay, say you ruined his property." It was a desperate bluff, but she saw uncertainty in their faces. "On the other hand," she continued, "you let Jake go and I'll come quietly. I'll tell Big Jim I'm ready to accept my fate. You get your money, no problems." "Eleanor, no," Jake croaked. She turned to him, cupping his scarred face in her hands. "You saved me. Now let me save you." "I won't let you." She kissed him, silencing his protests. It was their first kiss, and their last, gentle and desperate, and full of everything they'd never have the chance to say. When she pulled back, there were tears on both their faces. "Live," she whispered, "even if it's just for another year. Live free." Before he could respond, she turned to the bounty hunters. "I'm ready." They bound her hands, but as they prepared to leave, a new voice rang out across the mesa. "Nobody move!" Marshal Sam Cray appeared, accompanied by a dozen men, a proper posse, all with badges and guns drawn. "Gentlemen," the marshal said calmly, "you're in New Mexico territory now, and that young woman is under my protection. She's got a bounty on her, a bounty posted by a man currently in custody for murder. Any bounty he posted is null and void." Cray's expression was stern. "Moreover, attempting to kidnap someone in my jurisdiction is a hanging offense. I suggest you gentlemen head back to Arizona before I decide to enforce the law." The bounty hunters looked between Eleanor the marshal and his armed posse. The math was simple. Even $1,000 wasn't worth dying for. They mounted and rode away, casting dark looks back, but not daring to challenge the marshal's authority. Cray dismounted, moving to where Eleanor supported Jake, who was barely conscious now, his breathing labored. "We need to get him to a doctor," Eleanor said desperately. "Already sent a man ahead. Doc Williams is preparing." As they helped Jake onto a horse, Cray said quietly to Eleanor, "Big Jim Callahan was found dead in his cell this morning. Appears his heart gave out during the night." Eleanor stared at him. "His heart? That's what the death certificate will say." Cray's expression gave away nothing. Seems the stress of his arrest was too much for him. Eleanor understood. Someone, maybe Cray himself, maybe someone else who'd had enough of Big Jim's evil, had ensured he'd never hurt another woman again. "What about the bounty dies with him? You're free, Miss Hayes." Free. The word should have filled her with joy, but all she could think about was Jake slumped in the saddle, possibly dying because he'd pushed himself too hard to save her. They rode hard for Las Cruces, and Eleanor prayed to any deity that might be listening that they weren't too late. The doctor's office smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey, a combination that made Eleanor's stomach turn as she paced the small waiting room. Through the thin walls, she could hear Dr. Williams working on Jake, the sound of labored breathing punctuated by violent coughing fits that seemed to go on forever. Marshal Cray sat in the corner, his hat in his hands, watching her with sympathetic eyes. "He's tough," he offered. "I've seen Jake Morgan survive things that would kill most men." "But he's not most men," Eleanor said, her voice tight with fear. "He's sick has been for a year, and he never told me until—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "Consumption's a hard thing," Cray said quietly. "Takes the strongest men and reduces them to shadows. My brother had it, fought it for 3 years before it finally won." Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs unable to hold her any longer. "How did you know where to find us?" "Mrs. Garrett sent word. Said you'd likely head for Las Cruces if you made it over the mountains. I've been watching for you for 2 days." He paused. "She also told me about your situation with Big Jim. That's why I was prepared to intervene." "And Big Jim? Was it really his heart?" Cray's expression didn't change. That's what the death certificate says. Before Eleanor could respond, the door to the examination room opened and Dr. Williams emerged, wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth. He was an older man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "How is he?" Eleanor asked, jumping to her feet. "Alive, which is more than I expected given his condition." The doctor's expression was grave. "The consumption is advanced, as I'm sure you know. This recent exertion has accelerated things considerably. His lungs are badly damaged, and he's running a fever. But he'll recover." Dr. Williams hesitated. "From this immediate crisis, perhaps. With rest and proper care, he might regain some strength. But Miss Hayes, you need to understand this disease doesn't go backward. Every episode like this takes more from him than he can afford to lose." "How long does he have?" "I'm not God, young lady. I can't say for certain. Could be months, could be a year. In rare cases, people have surprised us all and lived longer. But," he trailed off, the implication clear. "Can I see him?" "He's asking for you, but keep it brief. He needs rest." Eleanor entered the room to find Jake propped up on pillows, his face pale and drawn dark circles under his eyes. But he was awake, alert, and when he saw her, he managed a weak smile. "You shouldn't have kissed me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now you'll catch it too." "I'll take my chances." She sat on the edge of the bed, taking his hand. It was hot with fever, but his grip was still strong. "You foolish, stubborn man. You nearly killed yourself protecting me." "Worth it," he said simply. "You're safe now. Big Jim's gone, the bounty's lifted. You can go anywhere, be anyone. And what about you?" "I'll rest up here for a few days, then move on. Maybe head down to Mexico. I hear the climate's good for the lungs." Eleanor felt anger rise in her chest. "So, that's it. You're just going to leave?" "After everything." "Eleanor." "No, I'm tired of you deciding what's best for me. You don't get to kiss me like that and then disappear. You don't get to make me love you and then abandon me to protect me from some future pain." Jake's eyes closed. "You don't understand what you're asking. Watching someone die from consumption. It's ugly, Eleanor. The coughing, the blood, the slow wasting away. I won't put you through that. But it's fine for you to go through it alone. I'm used to being alone." "We'll get unused to it." Eleanor's voice was firm. "Because I'm not going anywhere." "Eleanor." She squeezed his hand, cutting him off. "You gave me a choice back in the desert. You said I could come with you or try my luck alone, and you respected my decision. Now I'm asking for the same respect. Let me choose." Jake looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, hope battling against fear, desire against duty. "You could have a normal life," he said weakly. "Marriage, children, a home." "With who?" "Some man who sees me as property to be protected. Someone who'd make every decision for me because he thinks he knows better." She shook her head. "I've had enough of that life. I want something different. I want someone who sees me as an equal, who trusts me to make my own choices even when they're hard ones. Even if that choice means watching me die. Even then. Because whatever time we have, whether it's months or years, it's ours. And that's more than most people get." Jake reached up with his free hand, touching her face gently. "You're either the bravest or the most foolish woman I've ever met." "Probably both," Eleanor admitted, leaning into his touch. "But then you're the one who took on Big Jim's entire gang for a woman you'd just met, so we're well matched." A ghost of a smile crossed Jake's face. "When you put it that way." Dr. Williams knocked and entered. "He needs rest, Miss Hayes. You can see him again tomorrow." Eleanor stood reluctantly, but Jake kept hold of her hand. "Where will you stay?" Marshal Cray arranged a room at the boarding house. "Good. Be careful. Big Jim might be gone, but—" "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I've got my father's Colt, and I know how to use it now, thanks to you." She leaned down and kissed his forehead, feeling the heat of his fever. "Rest. Get better. We have plans to make." Outside, Marshal Cray was waiting. "I'll walk you to the boarding house," he offered. As they walked through the dusty streets of Las Cruces, Eleanor took in the town. It was bigger than Carson Creek, more established with proper storefronts and even a small school. "It's a good town,"
Cray said, noting her observation. Growing fast with the railroad coming through next year, plenty of opportunities for someone looking to start fresh. You're suggesting I stay? I'm suggesting you have options. The boarding house needs help, the school needs a teacher, and there's talk of opening a proper restaurant. A woman with skills could make a good life here. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story adobe building with a wooden porch. The proprietress, Mrs. Martinez, was a warm Mexican woman who greeted Eleanor kindly. Marshal Cray told me about you, she said in accented English. You've had a difficult journey. Come, I'll show you to your room. The room was simple but clean, with a window overlooking the street and a proper bed with clean linens. After days of sleeping on the ground, it looked like luxury. The marshal said you might be staying for a while, Mrs. Martinez said. If you need work, I could use help. The pay isn't much, but it includes room and board. Thank you, Eleanor said. I'll consider it. After Mrs. Martinez left, Eleanor sat on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. A week ago, she'd been trapped in Carson Creek, facing a fate worse than death. Now she was free in a new town with new possibilities, but all she could think about was Jake lying in that doctor's office, fighting for each breath. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging the spare dress in the small wardrobe, and placing her father's gun on the nightstand. At the bottom of her carpet bag, she found her mother's silver locket. She opened it to look at the tiny photographs inside her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, unaware of the tragedies that awaited them. I hope I'm making you proud, she whispered to the images. That evening, Mrs. Martinez invited her to join the other boarders for dinner. There were 3 others, a traveling merchant, an elderly widow, and a young man studying to be a lawyer. They were curious about Eleanor, but too polite to pry, for which she was grateful. After dinner, she helped Mrs. Martinez clean up, falling into the familiar rhythm of domestic work. It was soothing in its normalcy after the chaos of recent days. The marshal says you're a good cook, Mrs. Martinez mentioned. I could use help with meals. The boarding house is full most nights, and my old bones aren't what they used to be. I'd be happy to help, Eleanor said, grateful for something to occupy her time and thoughts. That night she lay in the comfortable bed but couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's pale face, heard his labored breathing. Finally, she gave up and sat by the window watching the stars and thinking about choices, the ones she'd made and the ones that still lay ahead. The next morning she was at the doctor's office as soon as it opened. Dr. Williams looked tired but less grave than the day before. His fever broke during the night, he reported. That's a good sign. He's weak but stable. Jake was awake when she entered, looking marginally better, though still frighteningly pale. You came back, he said as if surprised. I told you I would. I keep my promises. She sat beside him, noting with relief that his breathing seemed easier. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle, but alive. He studied her face. You look tired. Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts. About the future. Our future if you'll stop being stubborn about it. Jake sighed. Eleanor. I've been thinking. That's your problem. You think too much. She took his hand. Let me make this simple for you. I love you. You love me even if you're too stubborn to say it. We both know your time is limited, but so is everyone's. The only difference is we know it. That's a hell of a difference. Is it my father was healthy as a horse, one day dead from consumption within 6 months? My mother seemed fine, then fever took her in 3 days. Tomorrow's not guaranteed for anyone, Jake. He was quiet for a moment, then said, You really want this knowing how it ends? I want you, Eleanor said simply. For however long we have, that's enough for me. Is it enough for you? Jake squeezed her hand weakly. You know it is. I'm just trying to protect you. I don't need protection. I need you to trust me to make my own choices. All right, he said finally. All right, but we do this properly. If you're going to tie yourself to a dying outlaw, at least let me make an honest woman of you first. Eleanor's heart skipped. Are you proposing? Poorly, apparently. I don't have a ring, I can barely sit up, and I'm asking you to marry a man who might not live to see next Christmas. But yes, Eleanor Hayes, I'm asking you to marry me. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, Eleanor laughed. Yes, of course, yes. Jake pulled her down for a kiss, gentle and sweet. Nothing like the desperate passion of their first kiss on the mesa. "We'll need to wait until I can stand," he said when they parted. "Can't get married lying down." "We'll wait," Eleanor agreed. "Mrs. Martinez offered me work at the boarding house. I can stay there while you recover." "Good. That's good." His eyes were growing heavy. "Eleanor, yes. Thank you for choosing this, for choosing me." She kissed his forehead. "Rest now. We have time." Over the next week, Eleanor fell into a routine. Mornings helping Mrs. Martinez with breakfast and cleaning afternoons with Jake, as he slowly recovered evenings helping with dinner and listening to the stories of travelers passing through. Jake improved daily, though Dr. Williams cautioned against expecting too much. "The disease is still there," he reminded them. "This is a reprieve, not a cure." But Jake's color improved, his breathing eased, and by the end of the week, he was able to sit up and even walk short distances. Eleanor brought him meals from the boarding house, and they spent hours talking, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for whatever future they might have. "I want to see the ocean," Eleanor said one afternoon. "I've never seen it." "California is not that far," Jake mused. "We could go there. They say the sea air is good for the lungs." If you'll have me as a traveling companion, can't promise I'll be much use, but—" "You're all the use I need," Eleanor interrupted. "Marshal Cray visited on the 8th day bringing unexpected news. Found something interesting when we went through Big Jim's papers," he said, producing a document. "Seems your stepfather signed over his rights as your guardian, but the contract was never properly witnessed or filed. In the eyes of the law, it's worthless. So Big Jim never had any legal claim on me." "None whatsoever. Moreover, your stepfather seems to have disappeared. Left town the night Big Jim died, hasn't been seen since." Eleanor felt a mix of relief and sadness. Marcus had been a poor excuse for a stepfather, but he was her last link to her mother. "There's more," Cray continued. "Your father's ranch, the one your stepfather sold. The sale wasn't legal either. He didn't have the right to sell property that was willed to you. You could reclaim it if you wanted." Eleanor looked at Jake, who was listening intently. "The ranch is probably in ruins by now." "Maybe. But the land's still good. And with the railroad coming through, land values are going up. It was something to think about, a place to call home somewhere to spend whatever time they had together. But that was a decision for another day. 2 weeks after their arrival in Las Cruces, Jake was strong enough to walk to the church. It was a small ceremony, just Eleanor and Jake, with Mrs. Martinez and Marshal Cray as witnesses. The priest, Father Miguel, was understanding about their situation, offering blessings without judgment. Eleanor wore the dress Jake had bought her in Fort Courage, now cleaned and pressed. Jake wore a new shirt Mrs. Martinez had insisted on giving him as a wedding gift. They exchanged simple rings purchased from the local blacksmith, who did metalwork on the side. "Do you, Eleanor Hayes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" The words carried extra weight given their situation, but Eleanor's voice was strong and clear. "I do." When Jake said his vows, his voice caught on the words, "until death do us part," but his eyes never left Eleanor's. Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that brought tears to Mrs. Martinez's eyes. "Not the wedding I imagined as a girl," Eleanor said, as they walked slowly back to the boarding house, Jake leaning on her arm more than he probably wanted to admit. "Disappointed." "No, it was perfect. It was us. No pretense, no false promises, just truth." They had arranged to take over the boarding house's 2-room suite, usually reserved for long-term residents. Mrs. Martinez had decorated it with flowers and candles, creating a romantic atmosphere despite the simple furnishings. That night, as they lay together as husband and wife, Eleanor traced the scars on Jake's chest, each one a story of survival. "No regrets?" Jake asked. "None. You? Only that I didn't meet you sooner when I had more time to give you." "We have now," Eleanor said firmly. "That's what matters." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Eleanor's life. She and Jake created a routine that worked around his limitations. Mornings were usually his best time, when his breathing was easiest, so they'd take short walks around town, Jake showing her the landmarks and introducing her to the locals who'd come to accept him. Afternoons, when his energy flagged, they'd sit in their room, Eleanor reading to him from books borrowed from Father Miguel's small library. Jake particularly enjoyed adventure stories, though he'd occasionally correct technical details about gunfights or horseback chases. "That's not how you'd escape a posse," he'd say, and Eleanor would laugh and demand he tell her the right way. Evenings were for music. Jake would play his harmonica while Eleanor sang, their voices drifting through the boarding house. Other residents would sometimes gather to listen, creating impromptu concerts that brought joy to the small community. But there were hard days, too. Days when Jake couldn't get out of bed, when every breath was a struggle and the coughing brought up blood. On those days, Eleanor would sit beside him, cooling his fever with damp cloths, holding his hand through the worst of it. Dr. Williams visited regularly, adjusting treatments, trying different remedies. "He's lasting longer than I expected," he told Eleanor privately. "Your care is making a difference." "Love makes a difference," Eleanor replied. One evening, about a month after their wedding, Jake surprised Eleanor with an announcement. "I've been thinking about that ranch," he said. "My father's ranch." "Yes, Marshall Cray says it's still legally yours. The current owners abandoned it when they couldn't make it profitable. It would take money to restore it, make it livable again." Jake reached under their bed, pulling out a small leather pouch. "I've been saving for years. Never had anything worth spending it on before." Eleanor opened the pouch, gasping at the amount inside. "Jake, this is enough to rebuild, buy some starter cattle, last us a couple years if we're careful. But this is your money, us. Our money. What's mine is yours. Remember, for better or worse." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You want to go back to Carson Creek area?" "Not Carson Creek, but the ranch is far enough outside town to avoid most folks, and it's where you were happy once. Maybe you could be again." "We could be happy," Eleanor corrected. Jake smiled, though she could see the doubt in his eyes, not about their happiness, but about how much time he'd have to share it. They made the journey 2 weeks later, Marshall Cray accompanying them for safety. The ride was slow, with frequent stops for Jake to rest, but Eleanor didn't mind. Every moment was precious now. The ranch was in worse shape than Eleanor had imagined. The house was partially collapsed, the barn missing its roof, the fences down. But the land was still good, the well still had water, and the foundation was solid. "It's perfect," Eleanor said. Jake laughed, which turned into a cough. When he recovered, he said, "You're either an optimist or crazy." "Both. We've established this." Marshall Cray helped them set up a temporary camp while they assessed what needed to be done. "I know some men in Las Cruces who could help with the rebuilding," he offered. "Good workers, fair prices." Over the next month, the ranch slowly came back to life. Workers from Las Cruces rebuilt the house, just 3 rooms, but sturdy and comfortable. The barn was repaired, fences mended. Eleanor planted a garden while Jake, on his good days, supervised the work and offered advice based on his years of drifting through ranch country. Mrs. Martinez visited, bringing supplies and gossip from town. "People are talking about you two," she said. "The dying outlaw and the brave girl who loves him. You've become a legend." "Oh, we're just people trying to live," Eleanor said. "That's what makes it a legend worth telling." As autumn arrived, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust, Jake's health took a turn. The good days became fewer, the bad days harder. Dr. Williams made the journey from Las Cruces, but his expression told Eleanor what she already knew. "We're running out of time," Jake said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. His voice was weaker now, each word an effort. "We always were," Eleanor replied, holding his hand tightly. "Are you happy here with this life we've built?" "Happier than I've ever been." Especially knowing, every day has mattered, Jake. Every moment has been precious because we knew not to waste them. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have something for you." He pulled out a folded paper. "I had Marshall Cray help me draw this up. The ranch, the money that's left, everything goes to you, legal and proper." "Jake?" "And this." He pulled out another paper. "It's a letter, for after. Don't read it now, but after. It might help." Eleanor took the papers with trembling hands. You're not giving up? No, but I'm being practical. You taught me that to face truth head on. That night, Jake's fever spiked. Eleanor did everything Dr. Williams had taught her, but she could see him slipping away. As dawn broke, his breathing became shallow, labored. Eleanor, he whispered. I'm here. She lay beside him on the bed, holding him close. Was it worth it? The pain that's coming. Every second, she said through her tears. Every single second. Jake managed a smile. You were my redemption, you know, my chance to do something purely good. You were my freedom, my chance to choose love over fear. I love you. He said the words coming easier now than they ever had in health. Should have said it more. You showed it every day. That's what mattered.
As the sun climbed higher, painting their room in warm light, Jake's breathing grew quieter. Eleanor held him singing softly, the same hymn she'd sung that first night by the campfire. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Jake's hand squeezed hers once gently, and then he was still. Eleanor held him for a long time, her tears falling silently. When she finally rose, she kissed his forehead one last time. Rest now, my love. You've earned it. The funeral was small but meaningful. Marshal Cray came from Las Cruces along with Mrs. Martinez and Dr. Williams. Even Mrs. Garrett from Fort Courage made the journey. They buried Jake on a hill overlooking the ranch where he could watch over the land, and Eleanor forever. That evening, Eleanor finally read his letter. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then our time together has ended, though my love for you never will. You gave me something I never thought I'd have a reason to fight for every extra day, a purpose beyond mere survival. You asked me once if I regretted the path that led me to you. The answer is no. Every mistake, every wrong turn, every violent act that stained my soul was worth it if it brought me to that moment in the desert when you stood your ground against impossible odds. You saved me, Eleanor. Not from Big Jim or bounty hunters, but from dying alone and unmourned, believing I deserved nothing better. You showed me that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to be better despite it. Live my love. Live freely and fully. Take chances. Make choices, love again if your heart leads you there. Don't let my death become a cage. Let it be what our life together was, proof that love is worth any pain that follows. The ranch is yours, but more than that, your life is yours. I know you'll use both wisely. Until we meet again, in whatever comes after, all my love, Jake. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her heart. Through her tears, she looked out at the land stretching before her land now, her choice, her future. The next morning, she stood on the porch with her coffee, watching the sun rise over the desert. She could almost hear Jake's voice on the wind, see his smile in the morning light. I'll live, she promised the memory of him. I'll live enough for both of us. And she did. Eleanor Hayes Morgan became one of the most successful ranchers in New Mexico territory. She never remarried, though she had offers. Instead, she built a life of purpose and meaning, taking in runaway girls who needed shelter, teaching them that freedom was worth fighting for, that love was worth the pain of loss, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply choosing to go on. Years later, when Eleanor was old and gray, surrounded by the children she'd helped raise and the community she'd helped build, someone asked her about the legend of the dying outlaw and the brave girl who loved him. Was it true? They asked. Was it really worth it? Eleanor smiled, her eyes still bright with the memory of a scarred face and sage honey eyes. Every single second, she said. Every single second. The old woman stood and walked to the window, looking out at the hill where a simple headstone marked Jake's grave. The desert wind whispered through the grass, and for a moment she could swear she heard the faint notes of a harmonica playing Shenandoah. You kept your promise, she whispered to the wind. You saw me safe. Now it's almost time for me to keep mine to meet you in whatever comes after. But not yet. There was still work to do, girls, to help stories to tell. Eleanor Hayes Morgan had learned from the best how to make every moment count, and she wasn't done counting yet. That evening, as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Eleanor sat on her porch, the same porch where Jake had spent his last days, and opened a leather journal. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. This is the true story of how I found freedom, love, and myself in the harsh beauty of the American frontier. It begins with a desperate girl running into the desert night, and it ends, well, it hasn't ended yet. Perhaps that's the most important lesson Jake taught me, that endings are just beginnings, waiting to be discovered. As she wrote, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, wild and free, the way Eleanor had learned to be, the way Jake had helped her become. The desert had been her salvation. A scarred outlaw had been her redemption, and love, brief, painful, glorious love, had been her greatest teacher. Eleanor smiled and continued writing, preserving their story for generations to come. Proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom in the harshest ground, and that love, real love, transcends even death itself. In the morning, she would ride to town, help another runaway girl find her courage, tend to her cattle, live the full life Jake had wanted for her. But tonight, she would remember. She would write. She would honor the man who'd given her everything by dying in her arms, trusting her to carry on. You were my first real choice, she wrote, and you'll be my last regret, not that I loved you, but that we didn't have more time. Though perhaps that's what made it perfect. We knew every moment mattered, so we didn't waste a single one. The wind picked up, rustling through the pages of her journal, and Eleanor could almost feel Jake's presence beside her, reading over her shoulder, that slight smile playing at his lips. Did I get it right? She asked the empty air. The wind chimed through the bells she'd hung from the porch, Jake's favorite sound in his final days, and Eleanor took it as answer enough. She had gotten it right. They both had. Against all odds, despite all pain in the face of certain tragedy, they had gotten it absolutely perfectly right. The seasons turned, and with them, Eleanor learned the rhythm of grief, how it ebbed and flowed like desert flash floods, sometimes catching her unaware in the middle of an ordinary task. She'd be mending a fence, and suddenly remember Jake showing her how to twist the wire just right. She'd be cooking dinner, and hear phantom harmonica notes drifting through the evening air. 6 months after Jake's death, a young woman appeared at her gate, bruised and desperate, clutching a crying infant. Her name was Sarah, barely 17, running from a husband who'd rather see her dead than free. Eleanor took one look at those terrified eyes that reminded her of her own. That night she'd fled Carson Creek and opened her door wide. "You're safe here," Eleanor said, the same words Jake had once said to her. Sarah stayed, and word spread quietly through the territory. The Morgan Ranch became known as a place where desperate women could find shelter, no questions asked beyond what they wanted to share. Eleanor never turned anyone away, though it meant stretching resources thin sometimes. Marshall Cray visited one afternoon in late spring, finding Eleanor teaching 3 young women how to shoot behind the barn. Making sure they can defend themselves, Eleanor explained, watching with approval as Maria, a girl from Mexico, hit the target dead center. "Jake would be proud," Cray said. "I hope so." Eleanor holstered her father's Colt, the same one that had started this journey. "What brings you out here, Marshall?" "Couple things. First, there's a man in town asking about you. Eastern fellow claims to be a lawyer from Boston." Eleanor tensed. "What does he want?" "Says he has business regarding your late husband's estate. Something about family back east." Eleanor frowned. Jake had never mentioned family, had implied he was alone in the world. "Did he give a name?" "Theodore Morrison. Staying at Mrs. Martinez's place. Seemed legitimate enough, but I thought you should know before deciding whether to see him." "I'll think about it. What's the second thing?" Cray's expression darkened. "Cole Jessup is out of prison." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Big Jim's former enforcer, the cruel man who'd burned the Wheelers' mission. "I thought he got 20 years. Got released early. Good behavior, apparently. He's been asking about you too, though not as politely as the lawyer." "Is he heading this way?" "Unknown, but I wanted you prepared." That evening, Eleanor gathered the women staying at the ranch, Sarah with her baby Maria, and an older woman named Ruth who'd escaped an abusive son. "There might be trouble coming," Eleanor told them honestly. "A man from my past who holds grudges. You should know the risk of staying here." "You took us in when no one else would," Ruth said firmly. "We're not running." We stand together. Maria added, her hand moving to the pistol Eleanor had been teaching her to use. Sarah just nodded, holding her baby tighter. This is our home now. Eleanor felt a surge of emotion. This was what Jake had given her, not just freedom, but the ability to give it to others. The next morning, she rode to town, deciding to face the Boston lawyer before dealing with the threat of Cole Jessup. She found Theodore Morrison at the boarding house, a thin, precise man with wire spectacles and clothes too fine for the frontier. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, rising politely, "thank you for seeing me. What's this about Mr. Morrison? Your late husband, Jacob Morgan, was not quite the orphan he believed himself to be." The lawyer pulled out a leather folder. "I represent the estate of Margaret Morgan Whitfield of Boston. She was Jacob's aunt, his father's sister." Eleanor sat down slowly. Jake thought his whole family was dead. His immediate family was. His parents died when he was young, and he was raised in an orphanage. But Mrs. Whitfield had been searching for him for years. She only recently learned of his activities with the Baxter gang, and by the time she traced him here, he had already passed. What does she want? Nothing. She's dead too, passed 3 months ago, but she left provisions in her will for any surviving relatives. As Jacob's widow, that means you. Morrison pulled out a document. The sum of $20,000 plus a property in Boston, should you wish to claim it. Eleanor stared at the number, unable to process it. That was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. There must be some mistake. No mistake. Mrs. Whitfield was quite wealthy, and she had no children of her own. She spent her final years trying to find her brother's son, hoping to make amends for not taking him in after his parents died. Morrison adjusted his spectacles. She felt tremendous guilt about that. This inheritance was her way of making peace with it. Jake never knew. No, she found record of his death while tracing him here. But she was pleased to learn he'd married, that he'd found some happiness before the end. Eleanor thought about Jake, how he'd believed himself alone in the world, unwanted and unforgiven. If only he'd known someone had been searching for him, wanting to bring him home. The money would be transferred to a bank of your choosing, Morrison continued. The property in Boston is yours to sell or keep. Mrs. Whitfield only requested that if you have children, you might consider naming one after the Morgan family line. Children, Eleanor repeated softly. That dream had died with Jake. I'll need a few days to think about this, she said. Of course. I'll be in town for a week. Morrison stood. Your husband was lucky to find you, Mrs. Morgan. Not many would have stood by him as you did. I was the lucky one, Eleanor said quietly. She left the boarding house in a daze, the possibility of such wealth overwhelming. She could do so much with that money, expand the ranch. Help more women build a proper school. Jake's unknown aunt had given her the means to continue his redemption on a scale neither of them had imagined. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the figure following her until a hand grabbed her arm, spinning her into an alley. Cole Jessup grinned down at her, his face scarred from prison fights, but his eyes still holding that cruel light she remembered. Hello, Eleanor. Been a long time. She reached for her gun, but he was faster, pinning her wrist against the wall. Now. That's no way to greet an old friend. We were never friends, Eleanor spat. No, but we could have been. Could have been more if you hadn't been so high and mighty. Big Jim was going to give you to me, after he broke you in. Eleanor's stomach turned. Big Jim's dead. I know. Convenient how that happened right after the marshal arrested him. Cole's grip tightened painfully. Makes a man wonder if someone didn't help him along. What do you want? Justice, compensation. You cost me everything, my job, my reputation, 5 years of my life in that hellhole prison. You burned down a mission. You killed 2 innocent men. Following orders. Big Jim's orders, which I wouldn't have had to follow if you'd just done what you were told. Eleanor heard footsteps approaching and tried to call out, but Cole covered her mouth with his other hand. Here's what's going to happen, he whispered. You're going to pay me what Big Jim would have paid for you, $500. Or I'm going to take it out of your hide and then out of those women you're harboring at that ranch. The footsteps passed by without stopping. Eleanor bit Cole's hand hard, tasting blood. He cursed and backhanded her, sending her sprawling. Bitch!
来也继续一下的上
He reached for her, but Eleanor had already drawn her gun. "Stop right there." Cole froze, then slowly smiled. "You won't shoot me. Not in cold blood. You're not a killer, Eleanor." "I killed Big Jim," she lied, letting him hear conviction in her voice. "Made it look like a heart attack. Want to test me?" Doubt flickered in his eyes. "You're bluffing." "Maybe. Or maybe I learned from Jake that sometimes killing is a kindness to everyone else who won't suffer if an evil man keeps breathing." They stood frozen, Eleanor's gun steady despite her racing heart. Then Marshal Cray's voice rang out. "Drop the weapon, Jessup." Cole turned to see the marshal and two deputies' guns drawn. His face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he told Eleanor, then raised his hands in surrender. As they led him away, Cray helped Eleanor to her feet. "You all right?" "Fine." Her cheek throbbed where Cole had hit her, but she'd had worse. "What will happen to him?" "Assault, threatening behavior violation of his parole. He's going back to prison probably for good this time. He'll get out again eventually." "Maybe. But men like Cole Jessup tend to make enemies in prison. Sometimes they don't survive their sentences." The implication was clear, and Eleanor found she didn't care if Cole met a violent end. Some people were beyond redemption. She rode home to find the ranch in an uproar. Sarah's husband had found her arriving with 3 other men demanding his wife and child be returned to him. Eleanor found them in a standoff at the gate, Ruth holding a shotgun while Maria kept the men covered with her pistol. Sarah cowered behind them, clutching her baby. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said calmly, riding up beside the men, "this is private property. You need to leave." "Not without my wife." Sarah's husband, a thick-set man named Carl, growled. "She's mine by law." The law doesn't give you the right to beat a woman half to death," Eleanor replied, "which is what you did before she ran." "That's between husband and wife." "Not anymore." Eleanor dismounted, her hand resting on her gun. "Sarah's under my protection now." Carl laughed. What are you going to do, woman?" "Whatever's necessary." Eleanor's voice was steel. "I've faced down worse than you. Men who thought they could take what they wanted because they were stronger. They're dead now. I'm not." "You're bluffing." Sarah suddenly spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "She's not. She killed Big Jim Callahan, shot Cole Jessup. She's the woman who tamed Jake Morgan." The men exchanged uncertain looks. Eleanor's reputation had grown in the telling, becoming something larger than truth, but useful in moments like this. "Here's my offer," Eleanor said. "You leave now, grant Sarah a divorce, and never come back. Or we settle this with blood. Your choice." Carl's face reddened. "You can't." Eleanor drew her gun in one smooth motion, firing into the ground at his feet. The horses danced nervously. "That's your only warning. Next one goes center mass. You wouldn't dare. The law's on my side. You're trespassing, threatening residents of my property. I have every right to defend them." The standoff stretched taut. Then one of Carl's companions spoke up. "Come on, Carl, she ain't worth dying for." "There's plenty of women," another added. "Let's go." Carl spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Eleanor said firmly. "You come back here, you threaten any woman under my protection, and I'll hunt you down myself. That's not a threat, it's a promise." They left dust clouds marking their retreat. Sarah collapsed crying, and Eleanor went to her, holding her as she sobbed. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you." "You're safe," Eleanor said, remembering Jake's words. "You're all safe here." That night she made a decision about the inheritance. She would take it, use it to build something lasting, a proper shelter for women like Sarah, with solid buildings and legal protection. Jake's redemption would continue through the money from a family he never knew he had. She wrote to Morrison accepting the inheritance, then penned another letter to a lawyer in Santa Fe inquiring about establishing a legal foundation for women's protection. As she worked, she heard it again, phantom harmonica music on the wind. She smiled, knowing it was just her imagination, but taking comfort in it anyway. "We're doing it, Jake," she whispered. "We're balancing those scales." Over the next months, the ranch transformed. New buildings went up, a proper dormitory for the women, a schoolhouse where Eleanor taught reading and writing, a workshop where they learned trades that could support them.
The inheritance money flowed into creating something unprecedented in the territory, a place where women could rebuild their lives free from male control. Theodore Morrison stayed to help set up the legal framework, fascinated by what Eleanor was creating. Mrs. Whitfield would be pleased, he said. She was a suffragette, you know, believed in women's independence. Then I'm honoring both their memories, hers and Jake's. Word spread beyond New Mexico. Letters arrived from women seeking shelter, from reformers wanting to replicate Eleanor's model, from newspapers wanting to tell her story. Eleanor turned down most interview requests, but she did speak to one reporter, a woman from San Francisco, who promised to tell the story truthfully. The article, when it appeared, was titled "Love and Liberation in the Desert: The Widow Who Built a Women's Paradise." It told the story of Eleanor and Jake honestly, neither romanticizing nor diminishing their love or his past. One evening, almost 2 years after Jake's death, Eleanor was teaching a new arrival to shoot when she heard horses approaching. She turned to see Marshall Cray leading a small group, including a woman she recognized with the start, Mrs. Wheeler from the burned mission. "Eleanor," Mrs. Wheeler dismounted, embracing her warmly. "I've heard so much about what you're doing here." "I'm so sorry about the mission," Eleanor began, but Mrs. Wheeler stopped her. "That wasn't your fault. That was evil men doing evil things. But look what's risen from those ashes, something even grander than what we had." She'd come to learn from Eleanor's model to rebuild her own mission with better protections for the women they served. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and strategies. Mrs. Wheeler told her about other women across the West starting similar shelters inspired by Eleanor's example. "You've started a movement," Mrs. Wheeler said. "Jake would be so proud." "I hope so," Eleanor said, looking toward the hill where he rested. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked to Jake's grave. She'd had a proper headstone made with part of the inheritance money inscribed with words from his letter, "Redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to be better." She sat beside the grave talking to him as she often did. "You wouldn't recognize the place now. There are 15 women living here plus 4 children. Sarah's studying to be a teacher. Maria's becoming a crack shot better than me. Ruth runs the kitchen and mothers everyone." She smiled. "We're thinking of building a medical clinic next. Dr. Williams says he'll train one of the women as a nurse." The wind rustled through the grass and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. "Still miss you, every day. But I'm living Jake, living fully like you wanted, making choices, taking chances. I even danced at the Harvest Festival last month, shocked everyone." She laughed softly. "Marcus Stewart asked to court me. He's a good man, owns the neighboring ranch. I turned him down, gently but firmly. My heart's already spoken, for even if its owner is gone." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Eleanor made a wish not for Jake to return, which was impossible, but for the strength to continue what they'd started together. She was about to leave when she heard horses approaching fast. Eleanor drew her gun, instantly alert, but it was Ruth riding hard. "Eleanor, come quick. There's been an accident at the mine. They're bringing wounded here, dozens of them. They need help." Eleanor ran for her horse. The silver mine 10 miles away employed hundreds of men, many with families in the area. If there'd been a collapse, she rode hard back to the ranch, finding it already transforming into a makeshift hospital. Women were preparing bandages, boiling water, clearing space for the wounded. The injured began arriving just after dawn, men covered in dust and blood, some unconscious, others moaning in pain. Eleanor and her women worked alongside Dr. Williams, who'd also been summoned. "Cave-in?" one of the less injured miners explained. "Support beam failed. At least 12 men trapped." Eleanor organized the women with military efficiency. Sarah tended to minor wounds. Maria helped Dr. Williams with surgery. Ruth coordinated food and water for the rescue workers. The women they'd trained to be independent were now saving lives. For 3 days, they worked without rest. Eleanor found herself drawing on memories of watching her mother tend to sick neighbors, of Jake's steady presence in crisis. She held dying men's hands, wrote final letters to families, and never flinched from the hardest tasks. When it was over, they'd saved 18 lives and eased the passing of 6 others. The mine owner himself came to thank them. "I was wrong about this place," he admitted to Eleanor. "Thought it was foolishness teaching women to live without men. But you've shown what they're capable of. I'll be making a donation to your foundation." As the ranch returned to normal, Eleanor received another unexpected visitor, a young man perhaps 20, with familiar sage honey eyes and a scarred left hand.
Mrs. Morgan, my name is Daniel Baxter. Eleanor's hand went to her gun. Baxter, Tom Baxter's son, but I'm not here for revenge. He raised his hands peacefully. I'm here to thank you. Thank me. Your husband saved my life. I was 5 years old in that stagecoach he protected from my father. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. My mother told me the story when I was old enough, how a man from the gang turned on them to save us, how he faced down Tom Baxter himself. Eleanor's throat tightened. The little girl with brown eyes. Jake said there was a little girl. My sister. She's alive too, married now with children of her own. We've been looking for Jake Morgan for years, wanting to thank him. I only recently learned he'd passed and that you were his widow. Eleanor invited him in and they talked for hours. Daniel was nothing like his father. He was a school teacher, gentle and thoughtful, dedicated to education because Jake had given him the chance to grow up. He always carried guilt about his time with the gang, Eleanor told him. Knowing you've lived a good life, that it would have meant everything to him. I'd like to help here if you'd let me, Daniel offered. Teach the children, maybe help with correspondence. It's the least I can do to honor the man who saved me. Eleanor accepted, and Daniel Baxter became part of their strange family, the son of Jake's enemy alive, because of Jake's courage now continuing Jake's work of redemption. One evening, as Eleanor was reviewing plans for the medical clinic with Daniel and Dr.
Williams, Sarah burst in. Riders coming. Lots of them. Eleanor grabbed her gun and they all rushed outside. But instead of threat, they found a delegation Marshal Cray, the territorial governor, and several other officials. Mrs. Morgan, the governor said, dismounting. I'm here on official business. Eleanor tensed. What kind of business? The kind where the territory of New Mexico officially recognizes the Morgan Foundation as a legal entity with protective status. Any woman on this property is under territorial protection. Anyone who threatens them faces federal charges. Eleanor stared, speechless. Cray smiled. That article about you reached Washington. Seems the president's wife was moved by your story. She pulled some strings. The governor handed Eleanor an official document. You've built something remarkable here, Mrs. Morgan. Something that might just change how this country thinks about women's rights and protection. As the delegation left, Eleanor stood surrounded by the women she'd helped save, holding a document that would protect future generations of desperate women. She looked toward Jake's grave on the hill and whispered, We did it, my love. We really did it. That night there was a celebration. Music filled the air, not phantom harmonica notes, but real instruments played by women who'd found their freedom. Eleanor danced, laughed, and for the first time since Jake's death felt complete joy. But life wasn't done testing her. The next morning brought news that sent chills through everyone. Cole Jessup had escaped from prison during a riot. 3 guards were dead, and Jessup had vowed to finish what he'd started with Eleanor. We should get you somewhere safe, Cray urged when he delivered the news. No, Eleanor said firmly. I'm done running. This is my home. These are my people. If Cole wants a fight, he'll get one. She gathered everyone at the ranch. Those who want to leave until this is over, I'll arrange safe passage. No judgment, no questions. Not a single woman left. Then we prepare, Eleanor said. We defend what we've built. They turned the ranch into a fortress. The women took shifts, keeping watch weapons always within reach. Daniel helped coordinate defenses while Dr. Williams prepared medical supplies. 3 nights later, Cole came. He didn't come alone. He'd gathered a group of outlaws and malcontents, promising them riches and women. They surrounded the ranch in the darkness, thinking to catch the inhabitants asleep. But Eleanor was ready. At her signal, lanterns blazed to life around the perimeter, revealing the attackers and eliminating their advantage. The women opened fire from protected positions, their months of training paying off. Cole's voice rang out. Eleanor, face me, you bitch. 1-on-1, and this ends. Don't do it, Maria urged. It's a trap. But Eleanor knew Cole wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. She stepped out her father's Colt on her hip.
Right here, Cole. He emerged from the shadows, gun drawn. You've caused me nothing but pain. You caused your own pain. I just refuse to be your victim. Big Jim should have let me have you from the start, would have saved everyone trouble.
I would have killed you in your sleep, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. Or myself. Either way, you would have gotten nothing from me.
We'll see about that.
He drew fast as a snake. But Eleanor was faster months of practice, and the memory of Jake's lessons guiding her hand. Her shot took Cole in the chest, spinning him around. His gun flew from his hand. She walked toward him as he lay gasping in the dirt. This is for every woman you ever hurt, for the mission you burned, for the peace you tried to steal. Cole's eyes blazed with hatred, even as life left them. You're nothing, just a woman.
Exactly, Eleanor said. Just a woman who refused to break. With their leader dead, Cole's gang scattered. Some were captured by the territorial militia that arrived at dawn, summoned by a rider Eleanor had sent out at the first sign of trouble. Others disappeared into the desert, probably to die of thirst or snakebite. As the sun rose, Eleanor stood among her people, her chosen family of survivors and fighters. They'd defended their home, proved their right to exist on their own terms. Is it over? Sarah asked. This battle is, Eleanor replied, but the war for women's freedom, that's just beginning. Over the following years, the Morgan Ranch became the Morgan Institute, a beacon of hope for women across the American West. Eleanor trained others to establish similar shelters, wrote a book about women's self-defense that became surprisingly popular and testified before Congress about the need for legal protections for women fleeing abuse. She never remarried, though she had several offers from good men who admired her work. Her heart remained with Jake, their brief time together, a perfect, complete story that needed no sequel. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch where Jake had spent his last days playing his harmonica. She'd learned slowly and imperfectly, but the music brought her peace. The women and children living at the Institute would gather to listen, and Eleanor would tell them stories of the scarred outlaw who'd chosen redemption, the desperate girl who'd chosen freedom, and the love that had transformed them both. Was it really worth it? A young woman asked one evening, having just arrived with her own scars and sorrows. Loving someone you knew you'd lose. Eleanor smiled, the same answer always ready on her lips, as true as the day she'd first said it. Every single second, because love isn't measured in time, but in depth. And what Jake and I had went all the way to the bone, to the soul. That kind of love doesn't end with death, it transforms into something else. Purpose. Legacy. The strength to help others find their own freedom. She stood looking out at the land she'd reclaimed, the buildings she'd raised, the lives she'd saved. Jake Morgan gave me 43 days as his wife. 43 days of belonging completely to each other. Some people live 80 years and never get even one day like that. As night fell and the women dispersed to their quarters, Eleanor remained on the porch. In the distance, a rider approached another woman, seeking shelter, no doubt. Eleanor would welcome her as she welcomed them all with Jake's words, "You're safe here." The cycle continued. Freedom passed from one person to another like a sacred flame. And somewhere in the desert wind, Eleanor could swear she heard it, the faint notes of Shenandoah, played on a harmonica, a reminder that love never truly dies. It just changes. Form becomes something larger than two people, something that can heal wounds and change worlds. Jake had sought redemption and found it in saving Eleanor. Eleanor had sought freedom and found it in saving others. Together, even separated by death, they were still balancing those scales, one rescued soul at a time. The rider who approached that evening wasn't seeking shelter, but bringing news that would change everything. It was a young man from the telegraph office, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Mrs. Morgan," he gasped, sliding from his saddle. "Urgent telegram from Washington." Eleanor took the paper with steady hands, though her heart raced. She read it twice before the words sank in. The president was coming. President Cleveland himself, along with his wife, would visit the Morgan Institute as part of a Western tour promoting federal reforms for women's legal rights. "When?" she asked. 2 weeks, ma'am. They want to see what you've built here, maybe use it as a model for federal legislation. After the messenger left, Eleanor gathered everyone in the main hall. The news created a mixture of excitement and panic. The President of the United States would walk grounds where outlaws had died, where desperate women had found salvation.
"We have work to do," Eleanor said simply, though her mind was already racing through all that needed to be prepared. Over the next days, the ranch transformed again. Buildings were repainted, gardens were groomed, and everyone pitched in to make the place shine. But Eleanor insisted they not hide what they were. "We're not trying to impress them with fancy decorations," she told the women. "We're showing them the truth of what we've built, a place where broken people become whole again." Daniel Baxter worked with the children on a special presentation about their education. Sarah organized the women to demonstrate their various skills, everything from horseback riding to marksmanship to the small businesses some had started. Dr. Williams prepared a tour of their new medical clinic, where 2 women were now training as nurses. 5 days before the presidential visit, another rider arrived. This one, Eleanor recognized with a mix of joy and apprehension. Mrs. Garrett from Fort Courage, older now, but still sharp-eyed and formidable. "Thought you might need an extra hand," the older woman said, dismounting stiffly. "Besides, I wouldn't miss seeing you show up all those Washington folks for anything." They embraced, and Eleanor felt tears threaten. Mrs. Garrett had been there at the beginning, had helped when helping was dangerous. "Jake would be strutting like a rooster," Mrs. Garrett said, looking around at all Eleanor had built, "proud as anything of his wife." That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Mrs. Garrett shared news from Fort Courage and beyond. "That Marshal Sam Cray, he's a federal judge now, says you changed his thinking about what justice really means. He was always a good man. Maybe, but you showed him that sometimes the law and what's right aren't the same thing. That's a hard lesson for a lawman to learn." As the presidential visit approached, more people arrived. Mrs. Martinez from Las Cruces brought food and helpers. The Wheelers came with survivors from their rebuilt mission. Even Marcus Stewart, the rancher who'd once courted Eleanor, offered his men to help with preparations. "Not trying to win your favor," he assured her. "Just think what you're doing here is important. My own sister fled a bad marriage last year. Places like this matter." The night before the president's arrival, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She walked to Jake's grave, needing the comfort of that familiar ritual. "The President Jake," she whispered to the headstone. "The president is coming to see what we built. What you started by saving me that day in the desert." She sat in the grass, remembering those 43 days of marriage, each one precious and painful in memory. "Sometimes I wonder what you'd make of all this. You just wanted to get me to safety, and now look, we're changing laws, saving lives by the hundreds." The wind carried the scent of sage and memories. Eleanor could almost hear Jake's voice. "You did this, not me. I just gave you the chance. You chose what to do with it." "We did it together," she said aloud. "Everything I do carries a piece of you with it." She stayed until dawn, watching the stars fade and the sky lighten. As she stood to leave, she noticed something she'd never seen before, a small wildflower growing right beside Jake's headstone, delicate but determined, blooming despite the harsh ground. "Perfect," she murmured, touching the tiny blossom. "Just perfect." The president's entourage arrived at noon, a procession of carriages and mounted guards that kicked up enough dust to be seen for miles. President Cleveland was a large, imposing man, but his wife Frances was who truly caught Eleanor's attention, young, barely 30, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Morgan," the president said, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "we've heard remarkable things about your work here." "We do what we can, Mr. President," Eleanor replied, neither awed nor apologetic. "Would you like to see the Institute?" The tour began with the schoolhouse where Daniel Baxter had the children recite and demonstrate their lessons. The president seemed impressed, but it was Frances Cleveland who asked the penetrating questions. "How many of these children arrived unable to read?" "All but 2, Daniel replied. "Education is often denied to girls in desperate situations. And now they read, write, do mathematics, and study history. They'll leave here equipped to make their own way in the world." They moved to the workshops where women demonstrated various trades. Maria showed her leatherworking, creating beautiful saddles and bags that sold well in nearby towns. Ruth had her kitchen staff prepare a meal, showcasing how they could feed dozens efficiently and nutritiously. "This is more than charity,"
Frances Cleveland observed. You're creating independent citizens. That's exactly right, Eleanor confirmed. Charity keeps people dependent. We teach independence. The president watched Sarah teaching a new arrival to shoot his expression thoughtful. Some would say you're teaching women to be too independent, that it threatens the natural order. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. With respect, Mr. President, the natural order left these women beaten, sold, and desperate. If teaching them to defend themselves threatens that order, perhaps it needed threatening. There was a moment of tense silence, then Cleveland laughed a deep, genuine sound. You remind me of Frances. She's been saying the same things in Washington, just more diplomatically. Diplomacy is a luxury for those who haven't been hunted, Eleanor replied. They toured the medical clinic where Dr. Williams explained how they were training women as nurses and midwives. Rural areas desperately need medical care. These women will fill that need while supporting themselves respectably. The president's security detail grew nervous when Eleanor led them to the shooting range where 8 women were practicing. But Frances Cleveland picked up a rifle herself. May I? Eleanor nodded, and the First Lady proceeded to put 3 shots in the center of the target. The watching women burst into spontaneous applause. My father taught me, Frances said, handing the rifle back. He believed women should be able to protect themselves. Your father was a wise man, Eleanor said, warming to this unexpected First Lady. That evening they held a dinner in the main hall. The women of the Institute served a meal that would have graced any Washington table, while children performed songs and recitations. But the moment that changed everything came when Sarah stood to speak. 2 years ago I arrived here with a baby and bruises covering most of my body, she said, her voice steady though tears ran down her cheeks. My husband had beaten me so badly I lost hearing in one ear. The law said I belonged to him, that he could do what he wanted with his property. The room was silent, even the president's guards absorbed in her story. Mrs. Morgan took me in, taught me to read, to shoot, to believe I had value beyond what men assigned to me. Now I'm studying to be a teacher. My daughter will grow up knowing she owns herself, that no man has the right to harm her. Sarah looked directly at the president. That's what this place does. It doesn't just save lives, it creates new ones. Other women stood to speak, each story a testament to transformation. Maria talked about escaping forced prostitution in Mexico. Ruth described fleeing a son who'd threatened to kill her for his father's insurance money. Each woman had arrived broken and was rebuilding into something stronger. Frances Cleveland was openly weeping by the end. Even the president seemed affected. His usual political composure cracked. Mrs. Morgan, he said finally, what do you need from the federal government? Eleanor had prepared for this moment. Legal protection for women fleeing abuse, recognition that marriage doesn't equal ownership, funding for more places like this across the country, and most importantly, the right for women to divorce abusive husbands without losing their children or property. Those are significant changes. Yes, they are. But then freeing the slaves was a significant change too. Sometimes significant changes are necessary. The president exchanged glances with his wife, who nodded slightly. I'll take your proposals to Congress, he said. I can't promise they'll all pass, but I'll ensure they're heard. After dinner, Frances Cleveland asked to speak with Eleanor privately. They walked to the porch where Eleanor spent her evenings, the same porch where Jake had spent his last days. Tell me about your husband, Frances said. The real story, not the legend that's grown up around it. Eleanor found herself sharing everything: the desperate flight from Carson Creek, Jake's appearance, like an answered prayer, their brief marriage, his death, the continued work of redemption. 43 days, Frances mused. That's all you had together, Sat. 43 days of marriage, a few more of running, fighting to survive, not long by most measures. But it changed everything. Everything, Eleanor confirmed. Jake gave me the courage to be myself fully and completely. I try to give that same gift to every woman who comes here. Frances was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm going to fight for your proposals. Grover will present them, but I'll work behind the scenes, build support among the wives of senators and congressmen. We'll make this happen. Why? Eleanor asked. You don't owe me anything. Because I have power. I didn't earn influence just from being the president's wife. If I don't use it to help women who have no power, what good am I? Francis stood. Besides, your story has reached beyond these borders. Women across the country are talking about Eleanor Morgan, the widow who turned grief into revolution. It's not revolution. It's just refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable. That might be the best definition of revolution I've ever heard. The president's entourage left the next morning, but not before Cleveland made a public statement praising the Morgan Institute as a model of American self-reliance and redemption. The newspaper reporters traveling with him scrambled to get Eleanor's story, though she granted only one interview again to the female reporter from San Francisco who'd written about her before. After the presidential visit, donations poured in from across the country. Wealthy women in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia sent money to establish similar institutes in their cities. Eleanor found herself overwhelmed with correspondence requests for advice invitations to speak. "You've become famous, Kik," Daniel Baxter observed, helping her sort through the mountain of mail. "Jake would hate this," Eleanor said. "He valued privacy, staying in the shadows." "But he'd understand why you're doing it." "Would he?" Eleanor touched the letter from a senator's wife promising support for the divorce reform bill. "Sometimes I feel like I'm moving further from him with each passing day, like success is a kind of betrayal." Daniel set down the letters he was sorting. "Can I tell you something about that day? The day Jake saved my family?" Eleanor nodded. "I was 5, but I remember it clearly. My father, Tom Baxter, had his gun pointed at my mother. Jake stepped between them. My father said, 'You're betraying everything we built together.' And Jake said, 'No, I'm finally building something worth saving.'" Daniel met Eleanor's eyes. "I think he'd say the same about what you're doing. You're building something worth saving." That night, unable to sleep again, Eleanor found herself at Jake's grave. But this time, she wasn't alone. Sarah Maria Ruth and several other women had followed her. "We wanted to pay our respects," Sarah explained, "to thank him for saving you so you could save us." They stood in a circle around the grave, each woman placing a wildflower on the mound. Maria began to sing a Mexican funeral song, her voice carrying across the desert. Others joined in with their own cultural mourning songs, Irish keening Negro spirituals, Native American chants. The cacophony should have been chaos, but instead it blended into something beautiful, a symphony of survival and gratitude. Eleanor felt Jake's presence stronger than she had since his death, not as a ghost or phantom, but as a part of everything they'd built. His redemption lived in every woman who found safety here, every child who learned to read, every bullet fired in self-defense rather than aggression. "You did it, my love," she whispered. "You balanced those scales and then some." The months that followed brought both triumph and challenge. The divorce reform bill Francis Cleveland had championed made it through committee, though it would take 2 more years to become law. 3 more Morgan Institutes opened in Colorado, California, and surprisingly Texas. Each one run by women Eleanor had trained, each one carrying forward Jake's legacy of choosing redemption. But there were setbacks too. The ranch was attacked twice more by men angry at what it represented. Both times the women defended themselves successfully, but the violence took its toll. One woman was killed in the second attack, a young mother named Betty, who'd arrived just weeks before. Eleanor spoke at her funeral, voice steady despite her grief. "Betty died free," she said. "She died defending her sisters, her chosen family. That's more than she ever thought she'd have. We honor her by continuing by refusing to let fear drive us back into cages." It was after Betty's funeral that Eleanor made a decision that surprised everyone. She announced she would travel east, accept some of the speaking invitations from women's groups in Boston and New York. "But you hate attention," Mrs. Garrett protested. She'd stayed on at the ranch, becoming a grandmother figure to all. "I do, but Betty's death reminded me that we're still too isolated, too vulnerable. We need more than local support, we need national change. And that means I have to tell our story to people who've never seen a desert, never held a gun, never had to run for their lives." She appointed Sarah as acting director of the Institute and set out with Daniel Baxter as her escort and secretary. The journey east by train was Eleanor's first time leaving the desert since arriving with Jake years before. In Chicago, she spoke to an audience of society women who gasped at her descriptions of frontier justice and female independence.
In Boston, she visited the property Jake's aunt had left her, a beautiful townhouse she immediately donated to become another shelter. In New York, she addressed a crowd of 5,000 at Cooper Union, her words carrying over the hushed audience. "I stand before you as a widow," she began, "but not a victim. I lost my husband to disease, but I found my purpose in that loss. Every woman deserves the right to choose her own path, to defend her own body, to claim her own life. That's not radical, that's American." The tour was exhausting but effective. Newspaper coverage was overwhelmingly positive, though some editorials criticized her for encouraging female militancy. Eleanor didn't care about criticism. She cared about the letters that poured in from women saying her words had given them hope. In Washington, she met again with Frances Cleveland, who arranged a private dinner with key senators' wives. Eleanor told Jake's story in full, his past with the Baxter gang, his redemption, his death. She didn't hide or soften anything. "Your husband was an outlaw," one woman asked, scandalized. "He was, and then he chose to be something better. That's what America promises, isn't it? The chance to become something better than what we were." The woman had no answer to that. Eleanor was preparing to return west when she received an urgent telegram. The ranch was under siege. A group of cattlemen, angry about water rights and using the Institute as an excuse, had surrounded the property and were threatening to burn it down. She and Daniel caught the first train west, traveling day and night. Eleanor spent the journey in agony, imagining the worst. When they finally arrived at the nearest station, they found Marshal Cray, now Judge Cray, waiting with a contingent of federal marshals. "We got word 2 days ago," he explained as they rode hard toward the ranch. "The army's already there, sent by direct order from the president." They arrived to find the ranch intact but surrounded by soldiers. The cattlemen had been arrested, their siege broken before violence could erupt. The women of the Institute stood proud and unbroken, having held their ground for 3 days before help arrived. Sarah ran to Eleanor, embracing her tightly. "We did what you taught us. We stood together, refused to run, and survived." That night, as Eleanor walked through the ranch, checking on everyone, she realized something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer saving these women, they were saving themselves, each other, and her. The Institute had become bigger than her story with Jake, though it remained rooted in that love. She found herself once again at Jake's grave, but this time with a different purpose. She'd carried his letter with her everywhere, since his death worn soft from handling. Now she buried it beside him, keeping only the last line in her memory. "Until we meet again in whatever comes after." "I'll always love you," she told the headstone. "But I think it's time I stop living in your shadow and start living in the light we created together. I hope you understand." The wind rustled through the grass, and that lone wildflower by the headstone bloomed brighter as if in approval. Eleanor returned to find a celebration in full swing. The women were dancing, singing, rejoicing in their successful defense. She joined them, really joined them, not as their savior, but as their sister. They danced until dawn, wild and free the way Jake had helped Eleanor become. Years passed. The Morgan Institute became a national movement. Laws changed slowly but surely, granting women more rights, more protection, more freedom. Eleanor aged her dark hair, silvering lines mapping her face, with stories of sun and sorrow and joy. She trained successors, wrote books, testified before Congress multiple times. She even met with President Roosevelt years later, who called her the embodiment of American courage. But her heart remained at the ranch with the women who continued to arrive seeking shelter and finding transformation. One autumn evening, nearly 20 years after Jake's death, Eleanor sat on the familiar porch playing his harmonica. She'd gotten quite good over the years, though she still favored the sad, sweet melodies that reminded her of him. A young woman approached new arrival, nervous, and bruised the same look Eleanor had worn all those years ago. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm Anna. I heard you could help me." Eleanor set down the harmonica and smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "You're safe here," she said, Jake's words living on through her lips. "Tell me your story." As Anna began to speak, Eleanor listened with the same complete attention Jake had once given her. Behind them, the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of redemption. And somewhere in the wind, if you listened closely, you could hear it, the echo of choices made, chances taken, and love that transcended death to become something eternal.
The Morgan Institute would outlive Eleanor, would outlive all of them. But in that moment on that porch with that frightened woman beginning to hope the past and present merged into something perfect, Jake had sought redemption and found it in saving Eleanor. Eleanor had sought freedom and found it in saving others. Together, even separated by death, they continued their work. One rescued soul at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage building on another. Love doesn't end, Eleanor would write in her final journal entry years later. It transforms. Jake Morgan loved me for 43 days as my husband, and he's loved me every day since through the lives we've saved together. That's the secret Big Jim never understood that Cole Jessup died. Not knowing love is the only thing that multiplies when divided, that grows stronger when tested, that survives even death itself. But that was still years away. Tonight there was Anna to comfort, tomorrow there would be others, and the work of redemption would continue. Eleanor picked up the harmonica, again playing Amazing Grace, as the stars emerged, each one a promise that darkness never wins, not while even one person chooses to light a candle. The desert wind carried the music across the land over Jake's grave, where wildflowers now grew in abundance, past the buildings where women learned to be free, into the vast expanse where Eleanor had once fled in terror and found instead her destiny. It was a good life, a complete life. A life worth every second of pain that had brought her to it. And in the end, that was Jake's greatest gift, not saving her from Big Jim, not even their brief, perfect marriage, but showing her that redemption was possible, that people could choose to be better than their worst moments, and that love, real love, never really dies. It just changes form, becomes legacy, and lights the way for others lost in their own desert nights searching for freedom.